John Harker had a very bad day. Now he is in a world filled with insanely powerful aliens, paranoid humans with too much skill and way too much money, and people with superpowers and a debatable morality, and then there's the Joker. Yeah, he ain't getting close to that one. Not to mention the unbearable hunger and the need to act like a constipated buffoon. Yep, he's a vampire. At least there are many a comely lady with lovely necks and thighs, and he doesn't sparkle. Hello everyone, Omni-sensei here with What If I Were Reborn as a Vampire in the DC-verse? Part 1. If you enjoy this content, smash the like button. If you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to check out the original story linked in the description.
If you want to survive in Gotham, keep your head down and mind your own business. That's a lesson people learn quick after some time in her streets. It often came with a pat on the back and a few dollars in your pocket or a bullet through the skull in some nasty back alley because somebody was having a bad day. John knew it because he lived it. He grew up in these very streets, after all, and knew all about those shady deals below Gothic towers, the people in charge of the clubs and galleries and Fortune 500 companies, and all those new and exciting opportunities that attracted fresh blood by the thousands every single day, all eager to live the life in one of the most crime-infested, murderous places in the whole darn world. Lovely, but it didn't stop people from coming to this hellhole. How could they not? The highest concentration of wealthy individuals in the US of A and all the advantages it presented. High-paying corporate jobs, a massive consumer base for luxury goods, so much money flowing from their deep pockets to the industrial complex, the arts and movie scene, research and development, academia, and architecture. You name it, Gotham has it, and she has it better than just about everyone else. The best restaurants, the best bars, the best nightclubs, golf courses, the best insane criminals, and the best equally insane vigilantes. Gotham has style, it has pizzazz, and all the glamour you could want, and then some more. Even the healthcare system was as good as it could get, and unlike Metropolis, going there wouldn't ruin your entire financial future for 3 generations. Thanks, Bruce Wayne, for that one. Now consider the insanely cheap rent. As long as you're willing to live in the more impoverished parts of town, you'll quickly figure out why everyone from the bright-eyed would-be starlet to the gritty dock worker, and just about everyone looking for a fresh start would flock around the city like vultures who have yet to realize they are the carcass. Then again, John couldn't fault them. He was no better. Born to one of the many nocturnal animals who dwelled in Gotham's high-end clubs. Looking for a fancy lay they could hopefully entertain long enough to experience that 8-figure lifestyle and maybe sneak a cake into their oven if they were ambitious. Since he didn't grow up living la dolce vita in some out-of-town mansion and was often left to eat cereals for days on end while that hag was off trying to appear younger and kinder than she really was, it was safe to say that it didn't work so well for Mrs. Harker. No, her brand of predation was less baby-trapping millionaires and more like marrying a succession of reasonably wealthy, doubtlessly abusive, mentally unsound individuals. Hiding bruises on a child's arms was easier than figuring out which blue blood fathered him, unless it was the bouncer, or the club owner, or his friends. Her activity got them from Park Row to Gotham Village to Burnside and finally made him leave home to live with a touchy-feely anesthesiologist in the Metropolis suburbs. Not the worst stepfather he's had, by far. Obviously, he ran away as soon as possible to the one place where $300 could get you a roof over your head for a good month, where nobody cares enough to ask about your age or demand to see your ID as long as you pay up and don't make too much noise. A place where anyone could get a decent wage breaking their backs on the docks, as long as they had the sense not to check what's inside those crates. After all, to live in Gotham is to keep your head down and mind your own business. That's the first rule of the game. Follow it and you'll hopefully make it through the night. Unless somebody was having a bad day and decided to make it your problem. Listen, I'm not looking for trouble. John said something that would get a pretty boy like him mugged, beaten up, sexually assaulted any other night. But since the 2 gentlemen in front of him had guns, and since there was a man with a hole in his skull taking a nap on the floor, that ship had already sailed. I've heard nothing and seen nothing. In fact, I think I might not even be here, he said as sincerely as he could, hoping to at least get them talking. Works for ya. Now he knew there was no way they'd just let him go. But if one of them started monologuing instead of shooting, he could try and make a run for it. It was worth a shot. It was late at night, and the street lighting in the East End wasn't the best. They were only 1 block away from Brideshead, and that place was a labyrinth of tightly packed buildings. He knew he could lose them there. All he needed was an opening, and he could zigzag his way to safety. Thorne said, "No witness, old man." He heard a snarky voice say, though it could have been his imagination, "Sorry, kid, but it won't do." One of them approached, getting closer and closer to the one flickering lamppost lighting the alley. He could clearly see the shiny barrel of a huge revolver, the surprisingly nice suit, and the balding gray hair of the old man in front of him. Crap. He saw his face. Now things got much more complicated, but there was still hope. Maybe he could... Bang! Before he knew it, he was lying on the floor, a burning pain digging through his chest until the adrenaline kicked in. Whistle. "Darn, Joe, nice shot." He heard the other guy, a younger man, say it. He sounded amused, as if shooting some 17-year-old kid on his way home was normal. Maybe it was normal. This kind of thing happened every day in Gotham. The Batman couldn't be everywhere, and the police were too busy being nowhere. "Shut it, Keith. I told you to make sure people wouldn't get close." Joe, the man who just shot him, said it, though he didn't sound all that pissed. Yeah. No need to make a fuss. It's just some nobody." A nobody, was he? John wanted to get mad, to flip him off, to curse at him, to do something, anything, but he couldn't. He was just so tired, so cold. Breathing was starting to be painful, the adrenaline was wearing off, and he was feeling sleepy. "Go make sure he's dead, and do it properly this time," the older man ordered in that tired voice of someone who dealt with too much bullshit to care. He'd almost feel sorry for the guy if he hadn't just shot him in the chest and were asking his little boyfriend to confirm the kill. He heard 2 sets of footsteps, one leaving and the other toward him. "I am so dead." He was tired. He was hurting, but even with his vision getting all blurry, he could clearly see the bored expression on the man's face, the carelessness, the contempt as he stepped on his bloodied chest, pressing on the wound just because he could. "Just shoot me already, you sadistic prick," he thought, glaring at the bastard who only chuckled in response, then pressed even harder. John didn't groan or whimper. He wouldn't give him that pleasure. The pressure soon left, but the pain was still there. "He's dead." He could faintly hear that criminal reject say amidst the sound of his footsteps, those loud footsteps. Everything about these two was loud and obnoxious and lousy, as if they had nothing to fear. It was always like this. When the Bat was busy somewhere, the rats would get out and party as if to convince themselves that they ruled this city and no amount of beatings from a freak in costume would change it. Good. Now get rid of our communist friend over here. I have places to be. Screw you. He started thinking about his life, what little he'd accomplished so far, and his non-existent legacy. The outcome was most displeasing. Shit all or nothing. He barely lived. All those years were spent trying to survive. There were no goals guiding his actions, no higher purpose. And now it was ending in some nasty alley, killed by some random mooks for the crime of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. He could only close his eyes and wait for death. He was sure that he didn't know what to expect, but he was pretty sure that a wall of red text wasn't part of the equation. Warning. Host dying before scheduled time. Brute force awakening. What the heck? He was tempted to just gawk at it for a while, wondering whether he was hallucinating or if hell was a computer science course. However, he was dying, and if the magical text wall of death could help out, then he was all for it. Yes, he thought and regretted immediately. Integration started. Brace yourself. The mother of all headaches befell his poor self. A pain so strong his actual wound was all but forgotten. Then came the memories that were decidedly not his, and yet so familiar, natural. A whole other lifetime in another decidedly more boring world. One without masks and capes, where flying superpowered aliens and caped crusaders were nothing but fantasy. A world where Gotham and Metropolis did not exist beyond the realm of entertainment. A world where everyone knew thrill-seeking billionaire Bruce Wayne moonlighted as the Batman, Clark Kent was Superman, and an apocalyptic event happened every other day ever since the Justice League became a thing. Crap. In the span of a few seconds, John had lived and died. The shock was great and the pain extreme. But now he knew. He knew it was worth it. He knew the past, the secrets of this world. He knew the curse he received as a boon was his path to survival. He was still John Harker, that literal son of a bitch from Crime Alley, but he was more, so much more. Memory transfer complete. You will now receive the dark gift. The wall of text appeared for what he now knew to be the final time. His past victories were not nearly enough to warrant a system. He braced himself. Call it a hunch, but something told him that there was no way in hell changing his whole nature would be a painless process. He was wrong. It was so much worse. No amount of pain could compare to the cold, the awful cold. He could feel it in his veins, deep in his bones, in his very soul, twisting and corrupting, doing away with his humanity, his feelings and emotions numbed or roused to suit darker purposes. Old desires fading to make way for new alien appetites and vicious instincts. His eyes burned, and soon seeing in the dark became natural to him. His heart stopped beating, his blood stopped flowing. It didn't need to. And so did his body go pale and stone cold, like a corpse or an uncanny sculpted statue. He could go completely still if he so wished. Even his breathing was mere habit and served no real purpose. Yet he felt strong, stronger than ever. The bullet wound in his chest was healing already, knitting itself back to normal in a display that would make any normal person vomit or faint in horror. But he didn't. His body was no longer capable of such a reaction. No, he just watched in fascination, enraptured by the sight of the bullet being pushed out of his body. It was inhuman. He was inhuman. Vampire system activated. A small part of him mourned that which was lost. Another was excited by the power that would soon be his to wield, but both were meaningless in front of the sheer ravenous hunger he was feeling. Warning. Blood reserves dangerously low. Frenzy imminent. What the hell? Was his immediate reaction to his stomach actively trying to cripple him. He could barely think straight. I need. And it all went dark. Keith Gunman was having a very good day. He had 3 grams of the purest coke money could buy in his pocket, 2 escorts waiting in his hotel room, and he got to put a bullet in that stupid vodka-drinking dumbass. Working for Rupert Thorne was awesome. Sure, there were a good dozen levels of insulation between him and the big boss, and he was only ever sent to whack people when the less important outsiders wanted them gone. But the ladies didn't need to know that, do they? He whistled a nice tune while throwing his Soviet friend in a nearby dumpster. He was making Uncle Sam proud. Crack. He dropped the broski and reached for his gun, turning around to find the terrifying sight of nothing. There was nothing. The dead kid wasn't there. Just a puddle of blood. Damn, he said, trying to stop himself from shivering. Criminals were a superstitious bunch, and he was no different. We shot a damn spook. Joe will never believe me. No, he won't. What? Heath screamed, frantically looking around. This wasn't good. He had to get out of there. The one lamppost lighting the street flickered, and he saw it. A pair of bright red eyes in the dark, stalking him. Don't come close. He meant to command it, as he always did. He had a gun. He was a gangster. He was part of one of Gotham's greatest criminal organizations. He was powerful, goddammit, and some ghost wasn't going to scare him. Bang! 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 Keith closed his eyes and emptied his gun. When he opened them up, that thing was gone, and a clawed hand ripped his throat open, blood flowing like a fountain. He watched in horror as the kid they killed. No, the monster he failed to put down. He watched as it feasted on his blood, on his life. With his final thoughts, he cursed this beast. He cursed that old bastard Joe for accepting the hit, then leaving him here, and he cursed himself for not minding his own business. Thorne said no witnesses. What a joke. I've never seen the man. Keith Gunman died in some nasty back alley, all because somebody was having a bad day. Vampire rule number 1. Sunlight will not make you sparkle. Falling into a bloodlust-induced frenzy and going to a frat house party were oddly similar experiences. You wake up in a stranger's bathtub, covered in another stranger's bodily fluids. Your brain is a mess, and you struggle to remember where you are, what you did, and who you did it with. Luckily for one John Harker, vampirism was a gateway to abilities some might consider unnatural, and that included getting rid of supernatural hangovers. I messed up, he thought, still immobile in the empty tub. I remember ripping off that man's throat, feasting on his blood before leaving for safety. Safety was a relative term. He ended up back in this body's apartment, though it was, in his humble opinion, more of a crack house than anything else. He, in that beastly state, did not bother with getting rid of the body either. He just threw it in the dumpster alongside those thugs' other victim, a sort of poetic justice. At least his thirst was sated for now. Even if he wasted much of that man's blood, it was still enough to fill a good third of his reserves. Still, checking it wouldn't work. If he didn't use the more straining powers, he should be able to last 2 or 3 days before needing another meal, but he'd rather not risk it. Let's get moving. With a single thought, his eyes burned red and his senses grew sharper. The sound of distant cars and voices and the occasional gunshot grew louder and louder. He could hear every bristle, every step taken by the 48 people who lived in this building. Every word, every action, and gesture was laid bare before his eyes. More than that, he could see them, the blood in their veins, so warm and bountiful, so appetizing. It would be so easy to break into the homes of his sleeping neighbors and savor their blood until not a single drop is left of them. He knew he could get away with it too. I doubt they're the type who's keen on neck washes, though. He thought most of them were likely drug addicts anyway, and he knew better than to start feeding off the blood of junkies. Now certain that he was truly alone in his new home, and that it was nighttime, judging by the relative calm and quiet, he felt that it was safe to leave the safety of his gross bathroom and discover the marvels of his equally disgusting studio. Yeah, that's a crack house, he noted drily. The first thing he noticed was how utterly empty it was. Sure, he had only recently moved in, but it was supposed to be the room of a young man, not a ghost. The walls were cracked, the paint had worn off years ago, and if he weren't undead, he would worry about the risk of asbestos contamination. The only decorations were the suspicious stains on the walls. There were boxes upon boxes of wrapping, takeouts, Chinese food, pizza boxes, and soda cans his host body didn't bother throwing out. It formed a second floor, and he didn't need superhuman senses to see the many roaches roaming around, eating the rest. Guess that's what happens when you let a teenage high school drop out live alone in the ghetto, John thought, kicking a pizza box away and watching a swarm of bugs flee for their lives. Should I just burn it? Looking at those pests made his skin crawl, but the mere thought of fire was enough to put him on edge, so that was a bad idea for the moment. Anyway, let's see how much money I've saved up, he thought, trying to repress images of him agonizing in an inferno, his regeneration only torturing him further until there was no more blood to spend. He walked up to his bed, which happened to be the only piece of furniture in the entire house. It wasn't that good of a hiding place for his money stash, but the alternative was sticking it in the loo and hoping he wouldn't forget and take a shit. John looked at the dirty mattress, covered with a thick layer of what seemed to be plastic wrap. That was a pretty ingenious way not to touch whatever the hell those stains on the mattress were. A single neatly folded bedsheet rested above it, the only clean item in this whole house, including him. He moved it and did his best to ignore the family of roaches that scurried away. Now wasn't the time to give a shit. He recovered a plastic bag he had shoved in a hole in the wall and opened it to reveal a few crumpled bills, mostly 10s and 5s. $45, he counted in disbelief. He might not have all the details of this body's life, but he remembered enough to know he was no slacker, nor was he a drug addict, and he sure as hell didn't splurge money on stuff he didn't need. This is bad. Rent day was in a week, And this wasn't the kind of place where you can just ask the landlord to wait a couple days. The whole building was owned by the mob, and those who couldn't pay had a tendency to disappear, only for them to star in pornographic movies if they were lucky or be butchered up in some back alley if they were men. Now he could decide to flip them off and then eat them like the overgrown mosquito that he was, but that would attract the type of attention he didn't need. Not to mention the odds of him being disturbed during the day. Ending his new life by reenacting the witch burnings didn't sound so hot. That, and vampire or not, being shot in the face with a shotgun would still result in having a very bad day. So he'd either have to make an extra $255 in 1 week or somehow learn how to mesmerize people. And then there's this bullshit, he thought, looking up to see the ever-so-strange red wall of text appearing in front of him. Vampire system fully integrated. New task available. Know thyself. It didn't take some absurdly high IQ and the collective wisdom of Tony Stark, Reed Richards, and Jerry from accounting to understand what was going on. Eager to test out the real specs of this so-called system, he tried to see if a mere thought was enough to use it, since physical contact wouldn't always work. And work it did, much to his satisfaction. Tasks. Know thyself. You have successfully integrated the vampire system into your being. Explore its features and the rules that govern your blood or let ignorance drive you to your final death. Difficulty, F. Reward, 1 EXP. Progression, 1/3. That was informative. Getting missions was expected, and some form of reward was also a given. That's what he signed up for, after all. But a single experience point, and only 3 features, including the task's interface. John couldn't help but feel envious of the lucky bastard who got the gamer system somewhere in the multiverse. Well, there's nothing I can do about it. The second feature he checked was the most obvious one. Status, level 1. Name, Jonathan Harker. Age, 16. Titles, crack house resident, jailbait. Race, vampire, fledgling. Blood points, 35/100. XP, 0 out of 10. Talk about being minimalist. John whistled, though it was a bit underwhelming. He looked at the nearly empty panel, with no health points or mana reserves in sight. Level, name, race, and age were all pretty straightforward, but the rest were a bit more confusing. Crack house resident. You are a not-so-proud resident of one of Gotham's many ultra-low-income housing initiatives, and you certainly look the part and smell it too. Lower reputation with those of superior social standing, which is pretty much everyone. Increased reputation with crackheads, hobos, and the least fortunate. He really needed a shower. Jailbait. Through genetic superiority, supernatural changes, and a high-stress life in the streets, your mind and body are much more mature than a 16-year-old ought to be. Age is just a number, and jail is but a room. He had no comments. No complaints. But no comments either. Blood points, 35/100. Nightly consumption, 10 points. The amount used to wake up each night. 1 sip of blood from a healthy prey is equivalent to 5 blood points. Draining an adult to death would amount to 50 points. More if the quality is high. Waking up took blood, using his powers took blood, and he was pretty sure popping a boner would also require spending some blood. Affirmative. Darn. Experience, 0 out of 10. Experience is the measure of your growth, which can be obtained through maturing and understanding the intricacies of your power, indulging the ambitions and desires of the beast within or consuming high-quality blood. So get used to my powers, complete the system tasks, and be a power-hungry, blood-drinking humanoid mosquito? He could do that. Task progression, February 3rd. Inventory. He tried, hoping to get an answer even if he knew how unlikely it was. Team interface? Infection? He tried again. The vampire system cannot be used by anyone but the host. John wasn't sure why, but he felt like thousands of people just sighed in relief. He did his best to quell his curiosity, knowing nothing good would come out of this mess. Sigh. Abilities. Abilities. Vampiric physiology. The user possesses the traits, attributes, characteristics, and abilities of a vampire, a being who subsists by feeding on the life essence of living creatures. This includes enhanced physical, mental, and sensorial abilities in addition to an ageless lifespan. However, a deadly weakness to fire and sunlight is also applied. Fair enough. I'm a good-looking humanoid mosquito. Blood buff. Consumes blood to further enhance your physical capabilities. Can I use it in the bedroom? Was his first question. Task completed. Reward, +1 EXP. And just like this, the red screen disappeared, leaving him alone in his crack house with the most basic of plans and the ever-present temptation of just going on a blood-drinking spree. John changed his clothes to a relatively cleaner set. Going out with a blood-stained shirt was bad enough, but the bullet-sized hole right in the middle would make people think that he stole it off some corpse. Some might appreciate the hustle, but that's not the best look. He opened the door, nearly breaking off the handle. Every single part of that house was in ruin, but it was still in a better state than the hallway. John barely avoided the smelly puddles of piss, discarded needles, and other trash accumulated all the way down the stairs. Next time, I'll jump off the window. He took a deep breath when he finally left that junkyard of a building, once more thankful that he didn't need to breath on the way down. The streets were dark and poorly lit, a perk of living in the middle of the concrete maze that was Gotham's low-income neighborhoods. There was barely a handful of people hanging out, smoking, or playing a dice game after a tough day in a tough world. But he knew some random back alley wouldn't suit his needs. No, if you want to observe the community, you need to spend the time in the corners. A street corner was prime real estate for everyone looking to make $1. Mainly because it was filled with people looking to lose $1. Businesses of all kinds, from the mom-and-pop shop to the small-time drug seller, prostitutes, and panhandlers. Everyone was in the corner trying to make ends meet. Of course, not all corners are made equal, but John had a good enough grasp of his body's memories to know the best spots in Brideshead. Why go there, though? That would be a valid question. If he were looking to feed, targeting STD-ridden whores, perpetually high addicts, or twitchy kids with guns and an inferiority complex doesn't exactly sound like a smart idea. But he wasn't hunting for blood. No, John was hunting for opportunities. Hey kid, can you help me real quick? A sickly-looking brown man with unkempt hair, oversized clothes, and the kind of untreated bruises, scars, and overall appearance of the most important and vital part of the drug game, the American dope fiend. Most people, including him, have learned to ignore their existence. Just looking at them was asking to be hustled, and they were the very best at getting $1 out of a man. But this one was different. Maybe it was that spark in his eyes, the conviction to survive another day in the streets, or the easy smile on his face in spite of his rotting teeth, or even the borderline endearing misery of this poor fella. Or the fact that he was dragging up a whole fridge despite being in an uphill street, his arms and legs shaking and looking like they were about to give out. Yeah, it was probably the fridge. John shook his head, grinning. That man barely had any meat on his bones. He was clearly biting off more than he could chew. Please? The man insisted, chuckling uneasily. Well, if he were asking so nicely. He walked up to him and grabbed the out-of-place kitchen appliance, giving the stranger a second to steady himself before helping him push it up. At least, that's what he intended. What ended up happening was him easily pushing up the fridge and the man all but collapsing forward and nearly falling down face first like some hood version of Quirinus Squirrel. He'd try to stop his fall, but he was clearly not that good at holding back his strength, and he might just end up breaking his ribs by accident. Also, watching him fall down was too funny. I'm all right. The man said, despite nobody asking. He managed to recover like only a homeless fiend could. Thanks for helping me out, man. Folks around here don't have any human decency. You're welcome, John smiled, amused. Where do you want to put it? It's fine, kid. Just give me a few seconds to catch my breath, and I'll move it myself, he said, waving his hand coolly, but his shaky legs betrayed him. Nonsense, you look like you're about to keel over, he said, his voice full of mirth. You know what? I'll carry it for you. Got nothing else to do anyway. The man looked surprised and more than a little suspicious. Someone casually helping you out in Gotham was a strange occurrence, if not a welcomed one. But a stranger going out of his way and spending time and energy for a random junkie, well, that's one way of ending up butchered by some psycho. John realized it a bit too late, still somewhat unfamiliar with a Gothamite's way of thinking, but quickly found a way to salvage the situation. You're planning on scrapping it, no? I'll help you out for $20. He mentioned offhandedly, smirking when the stranger relaxed. Despite his talk of human decency, he answered kindness with suspicion and only felt at ease when a form of profiteering was involved. John could almost respect it. 20, are you crazy? I'll barely make $20 out of this old junk if I'm lucky, he said, shaking his head. Nah man, this isn't right. Do you think I'm stupid? This is full of good steel. You'd easily make $40. He argued, raising an eyebrow. Let's get moving. The scrapyard's a good 30 minutes walk from here, and it would be nice to get some sleep while it's still dark, the wiry man said, his previous fatigue all but gone. Name's Bubbles, by the way, and there's no way in hell I'm paying you $20 to move a fridge. Call me John, he said after debating whether or not he should use his real name. And 20's a good price. There's no way you could move it alone either. What about $5? Bubbles said innocently, well, as innocent as a middle-aged junkie could sound. $5? You're breaking my balls. Now you know how it feels. Kids these days trying to hustle up their elders. TSK. He shook his head. Back in my day, we'd do this shit for free, and we'd be happy to get an attaboy or some candy. That's why you were some poor arse kids. John shot back. $15 and no less. We might have been poor, but we had principles. You younglings are going rogue. He said morosely before sighing deeply. I'll go up to $10. I can't believe I'm letting you play me like that. John smiled. They were finally going somewhere. $10 and you show me around the neighborhood, he said. Haven't been here for long, and I don't like being clueless about the streets. Deal. Bubbles smiled, the kind of smile one made after ripping off a sucker real nice, but that was fine. John knew he could have pushed for more, but making money wasn't his main goal, or he wouldn't spend precious minutes of moonlight on some druggie. You new in town? Nah, I was born here, left when I was a kid, but ended up coming back anyway. He answered neutrally. He couldn't exactly explain the kind of mess his memories were right now. You're still a kid, Bubbles said drily. Piss off, he cursed, but only got a laugh from the happy man. Why'd you come back to this shithole anyway? I mean, Gotham's nice for some folks, but they sure don't live in East End. He couldn't be more right. If not for his vampirism benefiting from the smog, frequent rains, storms, snowy days, and the overall depressingly dark atmosphere of the city, then he wouldn't bother staying. His host body didn't know anything else, and calling the social services didn't even cross his mind. Well, you know how it is, he said, pushing the refrigerator. You can take a kid out of Gotham, but you can't take Gotham out of the kid. Yeah. Bubbles nodded grimly. That's some gay-ass shit you just said. He almost dropped the fridge. Screw you, Bubbles, he said, repressing a smile. His drug-taking companion had no such reservations, though laughing wildly in the middle of the night with no regard for those who tried to get some sleep. The Joker will probably appear in quite a few nightmares. So what do you want to know? John paused at the question and couldn't help but smile. It was an unnerving, hungry smile. Everything. John watched a car stop right in front of an exceptionally fat young man. The window was pulled down, words were exchanged, and money was given. The horizontally challenged fellow raised 2 fingers, and a teenager came running to pass something to the driver, who went off just as quickly. Ah, the polished art of drug dealing in the streets of Gotham. The money and the dope never get in contact. John was rather amused. These children were barely out of middle school, but they were already working a package. What about them? He asked his cheerful companion. The noble Bubbles, swindler of vampires. He took one look at the poster child for urban obesity before answering, as he did with the dozens of groups they've encountered before. That's Lil Kevin. He's slinging a package for Hungry, last I heard, Bubbles said, scratching his arm. He wore long sleeves and heavy clothes, but anyone could guess how badly he abused his veins. You should be careful around him. He's a toddler, but people say he's already made his bones. Duly noted, John said, earning himself a strange look from his clueless informant. If dope fiends were good at one thing, then it's knowing the streets. Who runs with whom? Where's the best real estate? Who got killed yesterday and why? Who's the hottest chick around? And why is it Catwoman? These were all questions they could answer if you bothered asking the right way. The 30-minute walk to the scrapyard ended up taking them a full hour, further convincing John that he was the one who got played. But he didn't mind. Now he had a pretty idea of the local turfs and street dynamics. There was no mention of men belonging to Falcone or that bastard Rupert Thorne. All he got were independents and semi-independent players who paid up to bigger fish, but none belonged to a higher class of criminals. The comics and shows often portrayed them and their goons as mustache-twirling villains involved across all levels of misdemeanors, from petty theft to retail selling of conveniently unnamed drugs. But that couldn't be the case, now could it? People like them wouldn't be caught dead in the same room as the dope, nor would their men or the men of their men. No, the game was dangerous, and while they could make more if they had their own men in the streets, it was the kind of greedy foolishness that brings down an empire. Smart men would let their money, muscle, and connections do the work. They'd smuggle in shipments of coke from the south at 10 or 20 grams per pure kilo, then do wholesale distributions in the city or in the whole country if they're big enough. A single kilo could bring up to $180,000 if they knew how to manage the supply. And these are the actual figures. That's how the underground benefits from the major ports. And John would bet his arse that la creme de la creme of Gotham's criminal entrepreneurs worked like this. And John already knew how he could get his share. They arrived at the scrapyard, which was nearly empty. Few people bother bringing the stuff they found so late in the night. But there was still enough for them to stay open and hire someone for the night shifts. The fact that said people often brought brand new items whose origins are dubious at best might or might not have something to do with their decision. Nobody could prove anything anyway. That's Gotham, I guess. Even legit businesses are a bit dirty. John wasn't exactly in a position to blame them. It was their turn to present Bubbles' findings to the worker. A fat man with salt and pepper hair, bags under his eyes, and a face that screamed, "Piss off, I don't want to be here." He barely reacted when John left a whole refrigerator in front of him. Nor did he react when Bubbles opened it to reveal a whole microwave shoved inside. What the heck? John looked at the shameless junkie. $40 for the fridge. It's in a pretty good state, and $15 for the microwave, the worker said monotonously, reaching into his pocket when Bubbles nodded earnestly. Thanks, man. He nodded at the worker, who barely reacted, and counted his bills before handing him one. Here, $10 as promised. Yeah, he got played. No hard feelings, right? The game is the game. Vampire rule number 2. Don't drink the blood of junkies. See you later, Johnny boy. And just like that, John was alone in the city with $10 in his pocket and a mind full of borderline insane plans. The night was young and he had much to do. With barely a third of his blood reserves filled, he couldn't risk testing the limits of his capacity, not to mention the lack of living relatives for him to slaughter. But he couldn't go on a hunt either, lest he feed on inferior blood, and his instincts told him that it was a very bad idea. He didn't want to catch the vampire equivalent of an STD. Truth be told, what he needed right now was money. Money to secure a roof over his head. He ought to get himself some supplies to protect his home from the sunlight. Sleeping in the bathtub because the windows couldn't close properly wasn't sustainable. He also needed clothes. Everything he owned were dirty, oversized rags that literally smelled like poverty. Keeping that crack house resident title wasn't good for business. You can look as good as you want, but dressed like the lowliest of hood rats, He wouldn't even be able to attract some wicked cougar looking to take advantage of him. Then he would need weapons, knives, or at least a good baseball bat. He couldn't exactly reveal his claws and fangs each time he got into a fight. Now could he? Guns might be a bit too ambitious for the moment, not to mention his lack of experience with anything but those small revolvers for self-defense, and he never even used it. Anything else could wait until he got his affairs sorted out. As for his hunger, if push comes to shove, he'll just sneak into someone's house and bite them while they sleep. Let's hope it doesn't come to that, he thought, not particularly thrilled by the prospect of sinking his teeth into a stranger's neck. But that was the cost of being a vampire. At least he didn't buzz around like a mosquito when he feeds. John sighed before focusing his senses to check for a possible tail. Finding none. Call him paranoid, but he wasn't about to act recklessly when he was still literally a newborn. His eyes burned red, enhancing his already clear vision and turning him into a radar for blood. His ears picked up on people's heartbeats, discussions in the apartment nearby, and the homeless woman squirming in a vacant house. It was thrilling until the culmination of his sharp senses resulted in him knowing that an obese man was jerking off to catgirls somewhere in the scrapyard. Yuck, was his thought on the matter. Somewhere, a blue-haired lady of easy virtue and loud disposition likely imploded in a rant about kink-shaming. John followed his instincts, crouched low, feeling the tension build up in his legs before releasing it in an inhumanly high jump. He couldn't help but smile widely. It was utterly amazing. And that's without blood buff. The young man felt light as a feather, in control despite being a whopping 30 feet above the ground. Said control promptly vanished when he started falling into a nearby low-rise building, barely holding onto the edge and almost smashing somebody's window in the process. All right, I'll have to work on this, he thought, easily pushing himself up to the roof. He started running, his attention divided between making sure he wasn't being observed, trying to not break the roof by accident, and avoiding another potential crash. Whoosh! His second attempt was more successful, and so was the third one and the fourth. Moving like this was becoming easier and easier, and soon he was able to pick up more speed, avoid the obstacles more easily, and keep tabs on his surroundings without losing his focus. He could still improve. Mastering his basic abilities was very much a work in progress, one that would take him weeks if not months to finish. Only then could one consider developing new ones. Being a human mosquito is awesome. Yo, get your ass in the stash, boy. We need a refill. A young, fat teenager yelled at his wiry counterpart after yet another sale. His street name was ironically Little Kevin, one of the many soldiers looking to make his fortune in the corners, one dope fiend at a time. He's been in the game since he was a younger, more naive fatso, starting as a lookout, working for clout in the kindergarten, and then graduating to hopper, working day and night in the corners making that bread. It's been years of paying up the lion's share of the package, only making minimum wage despite months spent in the boys' village and more than a couple rough rides with those nice folks in the Gotham PD. His ribs still hurt from that one time, but that was then and now was now. He's been promoted, made a real soldier for his trouble, and he makes points on the package. He gets a percentage if you're a schoolboy. How much did we make? He unwrapped a lollipop and asked his money guy, a youngster wearing an oversized Tom and Jerry hoodie. Kevin wasn't dumb. The older guys schooled him right, and he listened well. They told him to always separate the dope guy from the money guy and never to touch the drugs himself. Man, we're heavy as heck. The kid removed a huge stack of bills and smelled them like they were his hot teacher's panties. How much? Kevin spat on the ground. Before tasting the sweets, he didn't have time for this dumbass bullshit. F500, maybe 6? He stammered. He thought he was sneakily counting the bills again. 5 or 6? Make up your damn mind. Shit, I'm getting hungry. Go stash it with Duke while Mikey's refilling. I'ma get us some Chinese food. Lil Kevin glared at each one of the socially promoted retards that made up his crew as a warning not to muck up while he's off. He only had 5 boys to work with, 2 children working as lookouts on a school night, 1 middle school kid slinging for him, 1 banker, and 1 guy holding the stash. His boss would send someone to get the money and deliver a new package every week. The time it takes them to run a couple G-packs in this corner wasn't prime real estate, but still pretty good. Good enough to need a big G with a big gun off the streets to protect the dope and money. The Three Stooges went into one of the many vacant houses nearby and knocked 3 times on the large wooden plank they used to cover the door before opening. The guy inside had orders to shoot first and ask later, so they needed a way to recognize each other. It wasn't necessary, though. The man with the gun had been busy polishing his other weapon while holding a roughed-up issue of the Gotham Playboys magazine and barely managed to make himself look right when they got in. He was slouching on a scavenged, torn-up sofa right next to the flashlight they used to light up the room. Any other night, they would have laughed their asses off before threatening to tell Kevin about it, unless the horny shithead paid to keep their mouths shut. But tonight was different. "Man, you're gonna get... You heard that?" The Tom and Jerry guy, Dennis, said, his smile fading instantly. "Don't tell me you bought a girl, Duke, or I'm seriously gonna bury your ass. Damn you." Duke flipped him off, though he didn't look that threatening with his pants half on. Must have been a rat. He still picked up his gun just in case. Criminals are a superstitious bunch, after all. But in this case, they were right. Crack. A black blur broke through the makeshift door and collided with a helpless Mikey, slamming him face first at the wall. "The hell is that?" Duke screamed, raising his gun just in time to see the business end of some disgusting sneakers 2 inches away from his face. Crunch. Dennis felt numb, his gaze locked on the ground. In less than 3 seconds, his entire world was flipped upside down. Mikey was French kissing the wall. Duke was knocked out cold, his face a broken mess. And he was alone with this thing, his only weapon, a flip knife he didn't dare bring out. That would just be suicide. Maybe if he begged, it would let him go? He mustered enough courage to raise his eyes and then wished he hadn't. For an instant, the light blinded him, but what came next was much worse. It stood there, freakishly tall. Its foot soaked in his crewmate's blood was stepping on the one flashlight lighting the room, keeping it firmly pointed at him. That thing was covered in the shadows, and the only thing he could see was a pair of burning red eyes peering into his soul and finding it lacking. He felt his stomach turning, and his pants felt all warm and tight, and then he blacked out. Dennis woke up to someone screaming and slapping him. He opened his eyes to see a furious-looking Lil, Kevin, towering over him, holding a bag full of Chinese food. His Tom and Jerry hoodie was a mess of blood and what smelled like urine. Duke and Mikey were groaning loudly on the ground, clearly needing medical help, and there was a hole in the wall where they kept the dope and money. They'd lost nearly $1,000 worth of dope and twice as much cash. "What in the flying duck happened here?" his boss shouted, spittle flying everywhere, his fist clenching so tight his fat ass started sweating. To that, Dennis could only say one word: Batman. Vampire rule number 3. Would you like it if someone messed up your sandwich? No? That's why virgin blood is superior. Thank you for your purchase, a monotonous voice told John as he left the store. The miserable-looking clerk with huge bags under his eyes then returned to his book. John didn't bother answering, instead leaving the store with $200 worth of wooden boards, trash bags, bleach, deodorant, nails, plain white sheets, and various tools. Transporting the whole thing without a vehicle was a hassle, and it did make him look like a nut job, but this was Gotham, and nobody gave a shit when it wasn't their turn to give a shit. I need to get myself some proper clothes next, John thought, completely unbothered by the various people sizing him up to see if he was a good mark. I'll do that after I get my apartment situation sorted out. It took him a 30-minute walk and bus ride to get back home, and 2 different people tried to rob him along the way. Then again, he did live in Brideshead, and that was as East End as it could get. He stopped breathing while going up the stairs, now knowing better than to suffer the stench, opened his door, and was welcomed by the sight of his very own crack house. And with the spoils he got from his little visit in that corner boy stash, he even had the heroin. $1,000 worth of dope, sitting right there in his bathroom, and he had absolutely no use for it. Selling it was beneath him. Giving it away was stupid. Throwing it in the sewers? Killer Croc might get high and come back for more, but it was also a huge waste. A small, insidious voice in his head told him to just work the package. He would surely come across many more G-packs, and he wasn't exactly in a position to refuse $1,000, but he crushed it swiftly. Spreading this filth around would just create more dope fiends, kill other users, and create a whole bunch of orphans who will surely become the next generation of gangbangers and drug addicts. This kind of bullshit would just lower the overall blood quality, and that was something he couldn't accept. At least I got the $2,000 and a gun. He smiled, genuinely pleased with himself. That's more than this body could hustle in 4 months of work. Playing stick-up boy wasn't sustainable, and for people who can't take a couple bullets in the chest and shrug them off, it's not very safe either. But he didn't need to do it for long, and he could eat a few shots if need be, so he wasn't too worried at the moment. Dropping his supplies, John got to work turning his filthy crack house into a less disgusting crack home. He used some disinfecting wipes to clean his hands and nails, until now stained with blood and grime. He wouldn't catch an illness, but it was no reason to let himself go. Not to mention how rude it would be to make someone sick after eating them. With his hand no longer making Grandpa Nurgle proud, he put on a pair of gloves. Then another pair of gloves, just to be sure. Only then did he open up the first trash bag, start scooping up some of the trash, and ignore how utterly disgusting it was. If old John didn't get shot, then he would have died of some medieval sickness. One bag turned into 2, then 3 and 4, and slowly the piles of cardboard, plastic, aluminum cans, stained papers, and other trash started disappearing. 1 hour, 2 packs of trash bags, and a whole bottle of detergent later, John's house was now clean enough to be a pigsty. Hooray! A couple more days of intense cleaning, and it might just become fit for human presence, he thought, sitting on the mattress and wishing he could reward himself with some food. It was at this moment of light celebration that a New York-sized rat chose to take a stroll right in front of John. Maybe more than a couple days, all things considered. It was almost 4 a.m., and he would rather be ready to sleep by then, so he decided to make haste and finish his work for the night. Grabbing the plain sheets and the nails along with a hammer, he started turning them into makeshift curtains. He then boarded them up with every single plank he got before covering it up with 2 more layers of white sheets as an added precaution. Call him paranoid, but he would rather not get burned alive because he was too lazy to make sure the sun couldn't pass through. He finished his work by using his last 3 new sheets to improve his bedding situation. Laying out the first one under his plastic wrap-covered mattress as a carpet of sorts, wrapping the second one around the mattress itself, and finally using the last one as a protective cocoon. The one his previous body owned was used normally, covering him head to toe as a final measure. It wasn't the kind of things he pictured when he thought about life as a vampire, but now that he got there, it became an obvious necessity. And another burden. Once he's wealthier, he could start considering a safer and more glamorous way of protecting himself without looking like a complete freak show. But even then, he would need many safe houses around the city or the country even, and they were more likely to look like this than some luxury mansion. That was the distant future, though, and his present was here, and it demanded his full attention. Minutes passed, and he felt himself growing more and more sleepy, more tired. He tried to resist the torpor as much as possible to make future plans easier. John knew he could force himself out of day sleep if push came to shove, but it would require so much blood that his current reserves would be emptied 3 times over. Then again, pretty much everything was possible if he had enough blood to waste. By 4 in the morning, his mind and body were a sluggish mess. At 4h30, he could barely move. Hidden task complete. Safe haven N degree 1. Objectif. Create a relatively safe haven with reduced chances of burning alive during the day. Reward: 1 EXP point. Nice! He blacked out a few minutes after. The next night, John woke up to a feeling of growing hunger. Blood points: 25/100. He needed to feed soon unless he wanted to risk another frenzy, and who knows what he could do without a proper target right next to him. While going about his business the night before, he made sure to scout out a few good spots where he could get a nice meal, so to speak. Nothing too fancy. A good enough nightclub here, a fancy bar there, a 24-hour gym, and one of the many community colleges open in Gotham. The problem is, I look like a crackhead. He glanced at his clothes, old, ratty, and covered in dubious stains. That meant he had to do another investment. After making sure his stuff was properly hidden, he stopped breathing and left his fairly disgusting house for a horrifyingly gross stairway. He really needed to find a better place. Getting new clothes in this economy might have been a bad idea. A troubled John left the clothing shop with naught but a few bags and a much lighter wallet. The young lady who made the sale, though, seemed very happy. How on earth could a couple outfits cost him $1,000? All he got was some casual wear for nightlife in the city. Some warmer clothes and a winter coat with the added benefit of further concealing his figure. Some sportswear to avoid tearing his pants while taking advantage of that enhanced agility. And a few smart casual pieces to build a decent image in the eyes of the people he plans on eating. Alright, it might be quite a lot of clothes. And he did buy more than he first intended. He also might have accidentally avoided the cheaper stores and ended up at a higher-end boutique instead. Still, $1,000 is just robbery. He purposefully ignored how he made double that amount through actual robbery. At least he could go on a proper hunt after dropping his bags in the crack house. It would be his very first hunt. I hope I won't end up biting some coked-up slut, he thought, and that was a genuine worry he had. Such were the complications of a vampire's life, wondering whether or not your next got messed up within the last couple days. Something you can really only figure out after taking a bite. New task available. The limits of your palate. Objective. As a vampire, only the blood of the living can sustain your unlife. Most of the regular food turns to ash within your mouth. Others will disgust you on a fundamental level. But there are some meals you can tolerate or even enjoy to some extent. Finding out will allow you to avoid suspicion by publicly eating or concealing your true nature. Reward: 1 EXP point. John started at the red mission text before wordlessly dismissing it. He, however, changed his plans to dropping off the bags, checking out that decent-looking diner on Grand Avenue, potentially vomiting his Weasley black guts out, then going to some seedy nightclub to torture his enhanced hearing and sink his teeth into some hoe. Then maybe vomiting a second time for vastly different reasons. Nobody said being a vampire was easy. He walked into a poorly lit alley, hearing the distant bangs of gunshots 2 streets down, knowing the cops won't bother sending someone and the citizens won't bother reporting it either. In an instant, he disappeared, unbeknownst to the people shopping and scamming and touting in the dead of night. No one noticed him going from roof to roof, his body moving at speeds mere mortals could only imagine. No one cared when he emerged from another dark corner, and only the would-be thieves cared enough to look at him and his large shopping bags. But he was too big and too unsettling for them to try their luck. He wasn't complaining, though. Again he went up those darn stairs, passing by another tenant and his girlfriend, who tensed as they met, fearing the worst. John paid them no mind, content to go back home and put his bags near his bed. He stripped down, pausing for a moment to admire his compact, rock-hard muscles, the many scars he collected in this lifetime all but gone, leaving him with smooth, pale skin. He put on a clean black t-shirt with a matching leather jacket, a pair of jeans, and Chelsea boots. Well dressed enough to stand out from the local crackheads and small-time thugs, but not enough to attract needless attention. He looked like he could rock a nice suit, but dressing like that in these parts was just asking to be robbed. Satisfied with his looks, he checked his status, hoping to lose that rather offensive title. Alas, it was still there. Titles: crack house resident, jailbait. The stench of the hood was still on him, and losing it would take more than a new wardrobe. Figuratively speaking, of course, he doesn't have a wardrobe. John emptied his pockets, counting the dirty 20s and 10s until he got roughly $1,100. He put $1,000 safely in his jacket's inner pocket and left the rest in his jeans. He was ready to go. Taking a walk now that he no longer looked utterly miserable was a rather pleasant experience, but he still didn't fancy lingering in Brideshead more than necessary. He passed by several drug corners operated by different crews of different sizes, each of them vying for prime real estate and shouting about their product. Spider bags! Spider bags! Red tops! It'll make you sparkle. Get some red tops. Death row. Death row right here. He saw kids as young as 10 working in the corners as lookouts and touts, getting schooled by their elders. Some groups were more sophisticated than others. Some had better products. Others just held so much territory it didn't even matter what kind of weak dope they threw at the fiends. Addicts will buy it anyway. Nowhere did he see a shadow of the Cosa Nostra, the supposed kings of the East Side. Not a word of Italian was spoken in the corners, just regular poor English. No, it was just people from the East Side cannibalizing themselves to get that bag. Once he got past Brideshead, he started seeing a few police cars patrolling every once in a while, though the slingers were still out there selling their product. If the cops stopped, the corner boys would run. If they don't, business continues as usual. The boys in blue were so ineffective it was almost comical. At this point, all they could do was arrest people for possession or rough up people they know they can't jail for long. They were out in the streets fighting the war on drugs, making an innocent man strip down on the cold pavement, punching children, and showing them that the authorities were no better than they were. Stealing drugs and money and jewelry and whatever the heck they could get away with, like stick-up boys with a fancy badge and a legally obtained boomstick. Meanwhile, the real gangsters won't ever be caught touching a package or working a street like a bunch of ignorant peasants, and the big shots bringing the dope and coke inside the city were probably out there having a party with the politicians and other wealthy weasels funding the police department. As for the Bat, what could he do? Beat up a 14-year-old living in one room with his siblings and addict mother? The man is too kind for this. As John blitzed through the roofs, the streets started getting brighter and cleaner too. The towers and row houses and urban nightmares that made up the mess of low-income housing projects. The vacant buildings turned warehouses and havens for dealers and addicts alike. The misery and grimness and depression of the East Side started fading. There were more and more civilians going about their business, honest taxpayers trying to survive and stay away from the hell a few miles away from them. Things started becoming more working class. There were proper cars and shops, and people actually looked rather normal and not props in some rapper's song. Policemen were out there making folks feel relatively safer. It was still Gotham, though, and the cop is not much better than the crook. Still, it was an improvement. Not for me, though, John thought, realizing that staying in the shadows in such a place wouldn't hide him all that well if he didn't know how to sneak around properly. He jumped down from the roof, one hand sliding across the wall, keeping his fall nice and slow, less loud when he reached the ground. The vampire blended in with the humans, only getting a few seconds looks. Whether it was because of his good looks or the aura of the hood making people uneasy was still unknown. Just kidding, he knew he looked that good. There wasn't exactly a crowd outside. Most people in these neighborhoods were at home getting a good night's sleep before a hard day in the docks and factories and other honest jobs that paid too little for too much effort. But they were less careful than East Side folks. Felt warmer, more humane. People walking side by side on the sidewalk, parents holding their child's hand, young people laughing and joking without keeping an eye out for their ops or the likely possibility of starting a fight with you because they outnumbered you and felt like you looked at them wrong. It was cathartic and made his desire to move out even greater. He even managed to take a cab, and the driver didn't look like Ted Bundy's uglier cousin. "Where you going?" the middle-aged man asked when he got in. "Grand Avenue." "Sure thing, we'll get there in a few if the traffic's good." The cab driver wasn't much of a talker, so John was left free to lean against the window and just watch the people and the streets, seeing what Gotham was like for normal people. And sure, there were a couple gunshots here and there, and he did see a few shoplifters and muggers working their hustle, along with ladies of night with few clothes and too much makeup. But compared to Brideshead, this was a paradise. The ride felt much too quick for his taste, but he still paid and tipped the good man. He took a stroll for a couple minutes, and only then did he reach his destination. In front of him was a 60s diner with two large neon-lit words standing above the entrance. Polly's Diner. But to him, the name and the significance weren't the most interesting part. "Oh, what do we have here?" He couldn't help but chuckle. He saw the waitress through the glass, leaning against the counter and reading something. She was a pretty thing, black-haired and bright-eyed with just the right proportions. A nice meal. He could almost forgive the kill-me yellow low-cut uniform with the diner's logo on it, though it did nothing to conceal her rather sizable bust. More importantly, though, he recognized her. At this point, John already knew he found his meal for the night. Vampire rule number 4. Unlife isn't some cheesy movie for tweens. Don't expect people to fall head over heels because you're pale and look somewhat constipated. Max Black was safely nestled behind the counter and nursing a much-deserved cup of coffee. She really hated working nights in the diner, but the month was ending and her wallet was empty, and being a nighttime waitress paid better than just counting on the tips of other struggling clients. At least it's quiet most of the time. People come by to get a snack and hardly ever decide to eat it there. However, this wasn't most days. She held back a sigh and squinted her eyes to have a better look at the stranger sitting at one of the table booths, his back facing her. "Nice back," a voice in her mind purred, and she would agree if it didn't sound like her drunken slut of a mother. No, she wasn't a mother. She didn't deserve that title. Mothers were supposed to look after their children, protect them from the angry, hurtful world out there. Not snort line after line of coke while two men with real ugly faces joked about the kind of fun 3 people could have together. Nope, that woman was just the body she came out of. Bad thoughts? She chided, and decided to punish/reward herself with a nice bottle of whiskey, before remembering how broke she was. Maybe hot stuff would leave a nice tip? He better, with the kind of stuff he bought, all sorts of pies, drinks, and a nice serving of coffee. That's at least $60 sitting on his table. That's double what she makes in a full day's work. All 10 hours of dealing with ungrateful grouches, troublesome idiots, hipsters, and the occasional pervert. And he was just blazing it as if he didn't care. She was so busy drilling a hole behind his back that she barely noticed him turning his head to call her out. Max froze in place for a moment, believing she just got caught checking him out, and prepared herself for the onslaught of attempts to get in her pants. At least, the tips are gonna be good. She tried to see the bright side, and he does look yummy. That much was true. With his high cheekbones, bright blue eyes, and red lips, she couldn't help but wonder what they tasted like. Don't get her started on his insanely soft-looking, shoulder-length black hair. Would it be creepy if she asked what kind of conditioner he uses? Yeah, he looked good. "Excuse me, could I have more coffee?" He called her, looking more amused than anything else. "Sure," was her answer, gliding to refill his cup and taking a good look at his table in the process. His very full tables, filled with all kinds of food, Han wouldn't let her touch without paying full price despite her working there for months. Most of them were left untouched. He barely finished the chocolate and cherry cakes. Those delicious chocolate and cherry cakes. Her eyes were glued to it now that they truly experienced what yummy was, and she remembered that she ate nothing but a pack of gum and a few cups of coffee. "I think I might have ordered a bit too much. Would you like to have some?" he asked, and in that instant she might have kissed him if he weren't potentially a psychopath looking to make some new age sculptures with her guts. This was Gotham City. Even if he weren't a psycho killer, she had a boyfriend. Cheating at 20 years old wasn't a good look, even if it was an improvement compared to the woman who raised her. However, free food was free food. "This is delicious," she mumbled, finishing a slice of pie in 5 bites without using her hands. A personal record. "Glad you're enjoying it," the food dispenser said, looking at her cleaning his table in ways most waitresses never would. Talk about going above and beyond for the client. Client is king, even if he's an idiot throwing away good food. She thought, almost moaning when the chocolate melted in her mouth. Now this was the life. Yeah, he's definitely a psycho, she thought. He was sitting there chewing his food with a grimace as if it were cardboard. Sure, Oleg was most certainly not a good chef, but he couldn't mess up a strawberry cheesecake that badly. Not good enough for your tastes? She asked, not intending to be that harsh since he did share his food with her, despite being a reckless spender and snobby jackass.
I'm sorry.
And there he went, apologizing to make her feel bad. Boy was playing around with forces beyond him. It's quite good. I just can't find the appetite. Why you some kind of diet-crazy model? She pressed, half curious and half eager to poke the rich kid a bit. Why'd you spend $60 on shitty diner food if you're just gonna throw it away? With the way she talked to him earlier, her tip was already gone, so why bother playing nice at this point? Being rude wasn't as nice as money, but it had its own charm. Him frowning and giving her a "how is that any of your business, bitch?" Before giving her an opening to throw a few jabs at his ego was the outcome she expected. It's the one she'd gotten many times before, and likely the reason she didn't make nearly as much money as she should have on tips. Alas, Hot Stuff over there was dead set on subverting her expectations. No, there was no shouting or cussing and no opportunity to tell him that his prick was smaller than he'd like it to be, which was always true. Instead, that gorgeous prick had the audacity to laugh. Her back started tingling, and she felt her stomach drop, as if she did something extremely stupid. I wish I was. Things would be much easier that way. He kept grinning even as she gave him her best glare. Nah. The truth is that I couldn't afford a meal these last few days, so I thought it'd treat myself now that I'm doing better. Oh, was all she could say. She didn't think he was lying. Telling her he was broke as hell wasn't all that smart if he wanted to get laid, and he didn't seem the type of guy who needed to aim for a pity smash. Max didn't feel bad for him. She was buried in way too much shit to afford that kind of nonsense. She wasn't that kind of girl anyway. But she didn't feel all that good about herself for some reason. Must be the food. Oleg probably spat in the dough for shit and giggles. If she didn't feel like looking at him right now, it was for a completely unrelated reason. But despite her best efforts, an insidious voice kept whispering in her head. A voice that sounded like an elderly African-American man for some reason. You done messed up, girl, it said. Fix your mess while I go get some milk. It definitely wasn't coming back with the milk. It's still stupid though, she said more petulantly than she intended. Her gaze locked firmly on what was left of her cake. If someone talked to her like that, she'd probably punch them in the nuts. And here she was dishing it out to a stranger who invited her to share his meal. She really was her mother's daughter. Maybe, but at least it gave me an excuse, he said, and she raised her eyes only to regret it immediately. He had no business looking that good. It should be illegal. An excuse to do what? She asked, staring at his eyes way too long to be able to play it off, so she just owned it and continued ogling. To get a dinner date with you, he said as if he were talking about the weather, taking a sip of his coffee. It's not a date, Max said, ignoring how corny he sounded and how good it felt to hear it for some reason. Really? It sure does look like one. She took a second to think about it. A man and a woman eating and talking alone in a restaurant, albeit a rotten one. It did look like a date. It isn't one, though. He looked at her with an expression universally recognized as blood, please. It is not a date, she insisted. Sure, he said, rolling his eyes. Then what is it? I'm helping you finish your food, and I'm letting you ogle me. That's just part of our dinner date. He waved his hand to dismiss her words. There was no denying her ogling, so she just ignored that part and hoped real hard that he'd let it go. It's 2 a.m. We are not having a dinner date. Breakfast date then? Darn, our relationship is moving fast. Can't say I dislike it though. He whistled, a small smile on his face. What's your name, by the way? She hated to admit defeat, but there was no way she was winning this battle, not without bringing the big guns. I have a boyfriend, Max said, dropping the B-bomb and waited for the fallout. Either he gives up or he says he doesn't care and makes an arse of himself. Checkmate, bitch.
Iaba a boyfriend. Im John.
He continued smiling, where he makes a dad joke. Yes, this John guy was dead set on subverting her expectations. And the worst part was that she was actually having fun. Too much fun, maybe. Max could have flipped him off and left at any point if she truly wanted to. But she stayed put and enjoyed the banter. At some point, she probably went a bit too far. Maybe it was when she started laughing with him instead of at him. Or when she let herself feel something when he started matching her humor tentatively at first when he was not yet certain of how far she'd go. Then following her into the sweet depths of political incorrectness and jokes so dark even the French football team wouldn't take them. Maybe it was the moment she realized they were sharing one booth, their elbows touching every so often, and then just kept enjoying the moment. The looks they shared might have clued her in, but it all felt so natural, so innocent, as if they were just children sharing secrets and not two adults making dirty jokes. But if she were honest with herself, something she tried to do as little as possible to avoid having to actually deal with her problems instead of shoving them into a corner of her mind and then making jokes about them. If she did choose to be honest, then she'd know it was too late the moment she joked about her childhood but got neither laughs nor pity. He held her hand so gently it felt warm, despite how cold his skin really was. "Your mother's a bitch," he said, and that was as romantic as it could get in her books. Yes, she might do something wrong, but she was ready to deal with the consequences. "Ow, what the heck are you made of, dude?" she asked, rubbing her knuckles after they collided with his ribs. "Why did you punch me?" he asked with a mock frown and the pleased smile of a man who felt manly. "You said my mother's a wrinkled, ugly bitch. You might have added a few things, but it's true." "Yeah, but you don't get to say it," she explained. "And my hand still hurts. You should be more considerate." "Want me to kiss it better?" he asked with a charming smile, and at that moment she felt like she was having a breakfast date with some sort of devious monster. And she wouldn't have it any other way. Vampire rule number 5. You are not immune to STDs, so beware of whose neck you're biting. When Max Black clocked in this evening for night shift in this crappy diner, she expected many things, including but not limited to serving a bunch of starving hookers, chasing off hobos, and losing her mind out of sheer boredom and fatigue. What she certainly did not expect, however, was for an insanely hot, utterly annoying, overly patient stranger to just barge in and decide they were having a date. Even then, what were the odds that it would actually be enjoyable? Worse still, she had a boyfriend. Her first boyfriend that didn't try to rape her after giving her one drink too many, or end up sleeping with her mother because she didn't put out, or try to take her virginity in her high school's toilets. No, this was actually a decent guy. Never got in a fight, never said anything bad, and he sure as hell wasn't going to cheat on her. He went to college and majored in arts. He was part of a band. They still hadn't taken off, but those things don't just happen overnight. It took time, and she knew he had the potential to go big if he put his mind to it. Even if it didn't happen, she'd stand by him. They would find a way to make things work together. He was such a nice guy, after all. So why was she being held by another man? A man she knew nothing about, and yet her head was pressed on the crook of his neck, his cold but soothing palms caressing her hair, and that charming voice whispering things she couldn't understand yet craved desperately. The booth wasn't meant to hold two people in such a way, but he kept her comfortable on his lap all the same. She kept wondering how it came to that, but he kissed her neck once more, and she felt herself melt against him, her toes curled, and a moan escaped her mouth. More. It might be a mistake, but she was too far gone to care about it. His lips left her skin, but she continued to ride the pleasure, shuddering when his tongue licked her neck playfully. The pleasure faded, leaving her sleepy but content. She could feel herself go despite her will, but she still had enough energy to make one more request. "Don't leave me, please." "I might have overdone it," John mumbled, tucking a strand of his new friend behind her ear. Was it right to call her a friend after bringing her such pleasure? After feasting on her 4 times in a row, carefully repressing that primal desire to drink her blood till all that is left of her is an empty husk? After seducing her so mercilessly? Despite her fruitless attempts to avoid such an outcome, it probably wasn't. But when he looked at her flushed face and the peaceful smile on her face while she tried to merge her body into his, there was no regret in his heart. Task completed. The limits of your palate. Reward. 1 experience point. Nice. He was 1 step closer to reaching a new level of power. His attention was quickly shifted to something more unexpected yet rather obvious now that he thought about it. Hidden task completed. First hunt. Objective. Embrace your new nature and sink your fangs onto mortal flesh for the first time without falling into frenzy. Reward. 2 EXP. Ability. Blush of life. Instantly, the red text shifted to display his abilities. Abilities. Vampiric physiology. Blood buff. New. Blush of life. Spend 5 blood points per hour to maintain a simulacrum of life, restoring most bodily functions and allowing you to maintain the masquerade more easily. Did he just get rewarded with the ability to pop a boner? Well, he wasn't complaining. When he dismissed that last panel, he expected the onslaught of notifications to end, but he was pleasantly surprised with yet another unexpected reward. A successful hunt on your chosen prey might avail you an increase in power, the obtention or further growth of an ability, or a debuff if the blood is of poor quality. For greater spoils, target those with extensive power, skills, and importance in addition to their health and your own chosen preferences. Going against it might result in a decrease in experience or level or the loss of an ability in some cases. Successful embrace. Max Black. Blood quality. C. Virgin. Healthy. Willing. You have unlocked the ability. Presence. 5 experience points. Ability. Presence LVL 1. EXP. 050. Through blood influence. Presence is the ability of supernatural allure and emotional manipulation to attract, sway, and control crowds or individuals. Consume blood to give a feeling or impression to those around you, ranging from awe to fear to admiration or even safety. Using it allows you to easily become the center of attention at a price. Higher levels allows you to induce stronger feelings, effectively influence stronger-minded individuals, and increase the range of your ability. Shit. At his level, he could probably impress folks on a street corner or be more convincing in negotiations, but if he grinded it the right way, he might just get to the point where attacking him wouldn't even cross the mind of those who approach him. Then he looked at the experience required to level it up and understood that it was referring to the EXP points he gathered and not the result of intense practice. That kind of privilege was for those with a gamer system, not blood-sucking peasants like him. No, he was not still salty about it. Status. Level 1. Name, Jonathan Harker. Age, 16. Titles. Crack house resident. Jailbait. Race. Vampire. Fledgling. Blood points. 90/100. EXP. 10 out of 10. Level up. Darn right, I want to level up, he thought, and waited for whatever changes would take place. He hoped he wasn't going to bleed stinking black stuff out of his pores before turning into some jade-like beauty after a shower. Then his childhood friend would appear to try and sexually harass him long enough to make him fall in love. Until young Master Bruce Wayne comes and... What the heck was he thinking? Level 2. Name, Jonathan Harker. Age, 16. Titles. Crack house resident. Jailbait. Race. Vampire. Fledgling. Blood points. 90/200. EXP. 0/20. Well, that was anticlimactic. I'm hungry again, he thought, and couldn't help but glance at the body resting in his arms before shaking his head. If he took any more blood, she would end up in real danger. Still, it was quite late at night. It would be wise to leave if he wanted to avoid the sunlight. But leaving her like that didn't sit well with him. Should he leave and let her pick herself up like an adult? Or take a small risk and let her rest before waking her up? Vampire rule number 6. Being Alucard is the goal, not the starting point. It sure is nice waking next to somebody. These were her very first thoughts when she woke up, eyes still closed and enjoying the way her scalp was being gently massaged by those long, nimble fingers. There was something stupidly amazing about it, the way she was being held, the sheer safety and comfort that offset any possible complaint she might have with their pretty damn bold sitting arrangement. Yes, this was the life. Max! A calm, soothing voice called out between two caresses, further lulling her to sleep. John chuckled, and she felt it rumbling pleasantly in his chest. What was even more pleasant was the way he cupped her cheeks, indulging her with soft, lazy kisses that truly did nothing to help calm her heart. Groans. "You've turned me into a sappy bitch," she growled, but still stayed glued to his now warm body. "I'll make you pay for that." Another chuckle. "I'm sure you will," the culprit said with a fondness he didn't bother hiding. "But you need to wake up, sweetheart." "Don't call me that," she complained. "It's too condescending." "Honey," he tried. "Too old school." "Babe, too new to school." "Is it even a thing?" he asked, his voice betraying his curiosity. "I don't know. Can I go back to sleep?" she whined, opening her eyes and regretting it instantly. Looking this good should be illegal, and she was ready to die on that hill. Darn. What? Nothing. There was no point in feeding his ego. He was already a bit too cocky for his own good. "I can't believe I fell asleep like this. I'm not complaining. You were really cute," he whispered, as if he were telling her a secret. "Shut up." She smiled, but her face fell soon after. "You need to go, right?" "No, I should have left half an hour ago," he grinned. "But I didn't have your number, so there was that. My shift ends in a few hours. No chance I could convince you to wait?" She looked at him, looking more vulnerable than she'd ever allow herself to be. But he seemed to bring out the mushiest, most embarrassing parts of her. "Mine starts in a few." He sounded genuinely regretful. "Maybe another time. As long as you don't throw me away," she wanted to say, but wisely kept her mouth shut. She reached into her pocket to grab her pen. Then, feeling a bit unreasonable, she grabbed his hand and wrote her number on his skin, doing her best to make it as painful as possible without drawing blood. "I'll let him have his revenge later on," she smirked, thinking about all sorts of devious things they could get up to when she wasn't supposed to be working. Unfortunately, he didn't budge, as if he were made of solid stone. "You're no fun. I hope you know that." She huffed and absolutely did not blush when he was suddenly only a few centimeters away from her face. "I can be a lot of fun, believe me." And just like that, he was gone, leaving her alone in the diner to contemplate her choices. John Harker was a happy man. Undead, he was a happy humanoid mosquito. His hunger finally subsided somewhat, and he had sowed the seeds of what might grow to become a stable source of blood and entertainment for him. Call him an asshole, but he couldn't help but see the value in his relationships, even if said relationship was that of a predator and a particularly pretty snack. It was a fair trade as far as he was concerned. He gets blood, an increasingly dependent and thus loyal asset, and a whole lot of fun. She gets stability, safety, and the affection of someone beyond her reach. Everybody wins. "I'm just glad I got there before my sandwich got messed up," he thought, not caring about said sandwich's so-called boyfriend for even a second. As far as he knew, that child would be the start of a long series of disappointments that would end up with Max becoming a less disgusting, equally promiscuous younger version of her horrendous mother. This kind of life would leave her lonely and filthy, and might even let her perpetuate the cycle with a fatherless child of her own. That, or she turns into a bull dyke. Or worse, both things could happen at the same time. Yes, I'll make sure she has a happier life. If said happiness involved her being under his grasp, who could blame him? He took a cab to get him home in that sweet, disease-ridden, crime-infested East End, where the only game being played was one of murder, greed, and self-destruction. John planned to get back to his crack house before the sun showed its burning self up to roast him, maybe raid a few corner boys if the occasion presented itself. And he almost did, if he hadn't heard a pained groan. Now, that wasn't that uncommon. Living in Bride's head with an enhanced sense meant picking up on all sorts of cries, groans, and moans of people in more or less distress. But this one was different. He knew that voice. How could he forget it? It's the voice of the man who swindled him on his very first night in the streets of Gotham. The one and only Bubbles, an expert dope fiend and the indirect cause of half a dozen illegal drug seizures, losing a bunch of gangsters a nice sum of money. Oh boy, he looks rough, the vampire thought, almost wincing when he saw the state of the man. Didn't know it was possible. He was already rocking the weary crackhead look before, but now that's just depressing. At this point, his face was just one giant bruise. The poor man was barely able to limp his way forward. If it wasn't already obvious that he got mugged out of his already meager possessions, then he'd attract all of them East End hyenas looking for an easy meal. John approached him, silently getting down from his vantage point in the poorly lit rooftop of some low-income housing building. He crept his way behind the man for the sake of practice, if nothing else. If he could sneak up on a veteran hustler, he could sneak up on pretty much everybody. Darn, I'm getting good at this. He praised himself when he managed to stand right behind his injured not-quite-friend before clearing his throat to get his attention. Who? Wait, Johnny boy? How the hell did your white ass get here? Bubbles all but jumped away from him, further straining himself in the process. Great, now he was feeling bad for him. A lesser man would be crying at this point, but Bubbles was no mere man. He was a fiend, blessed with crackhead strength and the resilience of a needy junkie, forged through being pierced by 1,000 needles of dubious quality. Easy there, John said, trying to pacify the older man, but he got nothing but a few groans and panicked looks. Whoever did that to him has hurt more than his body. I need you to calm down. We need to get you some help. No, just leave me alone. Why won't you leave me alone? Bubbles roared, eyes wide and bloodshot, but to John it sounded more like pained whining than anything else. There is no reasoning with the man, not while he's in this state, he thought, now considering using this opportunity to test his newest power. Presence must be ideal for this kind of situation, and the cost was meager. Using it was surprisingly simple, as easy as moving his hand or looking somewhere. Instincts ingrained deeply in his being guided him, and he was wise enough to follow. In that instant, he felt the many possibilities his ability opened. The control it gave him was almost intoxicating. For some blood, he could push Bubbles' fear to new heights. He could foster his rage and make him lash out or appease him and give him some much-needed peace. John could awe, intimidate, and influence on a level most people could only dream about. Bubbles, calm down and tell me what happened, he said, feeling the small amount of blood vanishing while his target's posture relaxed more and more. I mean, you know harm, and you know it, right? Yes, I think so, the battered and bruised man mumbled in between two long, calming breaths. I'm sorry I lashed out. It's been a lot lately, even more than usual. It's all right, John said, putting even more power and blood into the ability, more than he ever intended. You can trust me. I'm here to help you. Blood points. 50/200. Bloody hell. He cursed, knowing full well what just happened. He got a taste of power and drowned in it, disregarding logic just to have a bit more fun. In other words, he got lost in the sauce. The affects were also rather obvious. Sorry. Thanks, kid. I'm really sorry. Shit ain't right. I'm telling you, it ain't right. The man looked like he had just met Martin Luther King and wasted no time before telling him all about his plight. John listened silently, only nodding every once in a while to encourage him. So if I understood correctly, some doped-up fiend has been following you around, beating the snot out of you and taking all your money and junk. And my shoes. Blood took my shoes, Bubbles added. I see. He thought about it for a few moments, weighing the pros and cons of doing something about it. For one, helping out a junkie was universally recognized as an exercise in futility. These folks are virtually useless, spending nearly all their time getting high or looking for a way to get high. They lived and died by the corners and would sooner die than give up the needle no matter what they say. Most of them do die too. Only a lucky few can break free. Helping him out would also set up a troublesome precedent. John couldn't keep giving a shit when it wasn't his turn to give a shit, or he'd never grow out of this garbage dump of a neighborhood, let alone reach the limits of his potential as a vampire. Every minute spent helping others was one he could have spent making money, hunting for blood, or making his own life that much more comfortable. On the other hand, Bubbles has already been a useful asset, he thought, looking at the injured man rubbing his swollen face with a pained wince. He was a reliable source of information and did a wonderful job snitching on every street-level dealer in the area, and that was only in exchange for some help carrying scraps. If he were truly dependent on him, if he somehow managed to get him on his payroll, then there was no telling how profitable it could get. Having eyes and ears in the streets, an invisible agent beyond all suspicion, who would suspect a known drug fiend in this business as long as he had his $10, the hoppers wouldn't look at him twice. Bubbles was also rather resourceful, more crafty than most folks out there. He'd call him enterprising if he had more ambitions than getting high and not dying. There was also his own opinion of the man. I like this idiot, he thought. It didn't have strategic value, but if he were ever to help someone, then it better be a likable person. And Bubbles was as likable as one could be without having tits. What should I do? He asked himself, but already knew the answer. Vampire rule number 7. Don't be a messy eater. Take what you need from people and make sure everyone involved is either satisfied with the outcome or too dead to complain. John looked at the beaten form of Bubbles, the noble hustler, and couldn't help but extend his help in the name of justice, peace, and democracy. It had absolutely nothing to do with the possibility of gaining a very promising asset. Nor did he even consider the benefits of being the shining light in the life of a miserable man left behind by society. Only a wicked man could desire that kind of ill-gotten loyalty. John wasn't this kind of man. It was all done for the greater good. His lips curled into a comforting smile, and he unleashed his presence upon the vulnerable man for the second time, once more awing him and capturing his full attention. I will do everything in my power to help you get through this, Bubbles, John said with conviction, looking him in the eyes. You have my word. The battered junkie stood there like a statue, mouth wide open and unable to comprehend what was happening. What he did to deserve this kind of help. He was nothing but an addict, a filthy, unreliable, deceitful addict who'd lie and cheat and betray the people closest to him in the name of the needle. There was no denying that. He looked his sister in the eyes when he told her he was getting clean, before robbing her home clean and selling everything for a few dollars. He stole ground stashes of drugs from careless youths, and he hardly felt a thing when he watched them getting beaten for their errors. He even stole painkillers from an ambulance for goodness' sake. It's all in the game, he'd say, justifying anything and everything, as if it meant something, like the game had rules, like it could be won. That's the kind of life he has, one he knows will end somewhere in a vacant house, with him overdosing and choking on his vomit, rotting there till the neighbors complain about a dying animal stinking up the place. But at the moment, watching the tall young man with bright blue eyes and looks that would make those movie stars seem like horse-faced hobos, listening to him speak words that belonged in a church, coming out of the mouth of a lying priest before he touched his third child of the day, or some old stories where the hero would come to save the day. He didn't feel like a dope fiend, a soldier who trusted nothing and believed in no one, or a man who lived and died by the needles that ruined his life. He didn't feel like good old Bubbles. He felt like Reginald Cousins, that kid with big hopes and a kind heart, before he got chewed up and spat out by this city and the people in it and those cruel games they played. ALR, all right? He barely managed to say, wiping his moist eyes and snotty nose with his sleeve. Good man? John smiled brightly, and Bubbles felt himself getting bolder. His body still hurt like a mean bitch, but he felt stronger somehow, braver. He had forgotten how nice it felt to have someone looking out for him. It's been so long. Do you have somewhere you can crash in for the night? The young man asked, and he nodded, telling him about his hideout close by, the second floor of a warmer vacant house. His instincts honed through years spent in the street told him to shut up, but he was brave enough to ignore it. "Here, take this," John said, giving him a couple $20 bills. "Get yourself some food, some shoes too if possible. It should be enough." The vampire knew it would likely be spent on drugs, but that was not the point. He needed to foster what little trust had been built between them, something stronger than a single positive encounter followed by a ruthless emotional bombardment when he was at his most vulnerable. If that meant parting with a few dollars, so be it. Technically, it was the drug dealers paying up anyway. "I just hope he won't end up overdosing tonight. Would be really funny though," he thought, smiling a bit, which the junkie took as a friendly gesture. "Thank you, man, I will." Bubbles mumbled, both of them knowing he wouldn't keep his word on the matter. "Great, let's call it a night," John said calmly. "Tomorrow at midnight, you and I will take a walk around the neighborhood, and we'll teach a lesson to your troublesome little friend." "What? That's it?" the junkie asked. "Yup, you show me the guy, and I make sure he doesn't trouble you again. That's all it needs to be," he said with a small smile, a bit curious about the kind of far-fetched plan the injured man had cooked up in his drug-craving mind. "I dunno. I expected something more." Bubbles scratched his head. John shook his head. "Sometimes, less is more," he said, bidding farewell to his asset in the making. The night was about to end, and he was eager to lighten a few hoppers of the burden of a full stash. Keeping so much money could be very dangerous. Then again, drug dealers were a reckless bunch. He walked into a dark alley, focusing on the world around him. His signature blue eyes turned a dangerous red, and he was soon nowhere to be seen. In the span of half an hour, Bridehead's corner boys faced yet another onslaught from a mysterious figure. "Arg! My head! My knee! He broke my knees! Please don't break my balls! Take anything you want but leave my balls alone!" Some thought it was the bat. Others believed it was just a particularly competent and violent stick-up boy made more fearsome by the rumors and exaggerations of victims eager to salvage their reputations. John knew not of it and cared not for it, though. He was $4,000 richer, and his bathroom was filled with more bags of heroin that he had no use for. He slid inside his bed, content with the knowledge that he would soon be able to move away from this poorly disguised crack house he called home. However, something was telling him that his peace won't last. Most of the freaks were behind bars or confined in the asylum. The kingpins of Gotham had greater concerns than some upstart emptying some gangster stashes, and those with real power in this world had yet to make a move. There was no Justice League yet, no one inviting dangers of a higher caliber, but also no one to defend against such threats. Darkseid, Brainiac, and Trigon. Not to mention that many alien civilizations eager to plunder, pillage, and otherwise pilfer all the resources on this earth to fuel their advanced empires. Sooner or later, the chaos would come, and he must be prepared. John felt like a soccer mom. Life truly was unpredictable. To think that the age-defying, blood-drinking abomination that he was would ever be in such a position was pure madness. Yet here I stand, ready to berate a bully for picking on those weaker than him. He thought it was almost funny. "Is it the guy?" he asked, his voice masking his disbelief at what he was about to do. "You're sure? You think I'd let you beat up some random-ass dude? Of course it's him. I'll never forget his ugly mug," Bubbles said bitterly, glaring at the oblivious man laughing with other homeless men around a dumpster fire. "I've never said anything about beating him up," John said, approaching the group with a nervous Bubbles in tow. "You said you'd teach him a lesson," the older man complained. "And teach him I will, using words, like civilized people," he said, ignoring his whining. Was it too late to give him up and cultivate another tool? It wasn't like he invested all that much into this guy. "Where the hell are you going, pretty boy?" The tall, rather muscular crackhead he intended to converse with screamed at him before he could say anything, sending spittle flying everywhere. Now John thought he was a rather calm person. but he also just saw a drop of spit leave a junkie's mouth and land on his face. Change of plans. Bubs, I'm going to beat the shit out of him, he said slowly, wiping it off with his sleeve. Hell yeah. Bubbles cheered. Acting before the junkie's brain could process the information, John's fist collided with his gut at a fraction of his full strength. It was still more than enough for him to double over with a pained grunt. The vampire was about to finish him with a kick in the mouth, but he overestimated the resilience of a crackhead. Either that, or he underestimated his own strength. The poor thing was choking up on his own vomit. A message has been sent, and judging by the look on his face, a lesson has been learned. Before long, the two of them left, following a trail of lamplight and being observed by the many weary souls who decided to waste their time and energy on the infamous streets and corners of Brideshead. Touts and dealers shouted their product's name as if they were street legal, advertising better than most executives with the fancy suits and briefcases. Lethal injection. Our shit's so good it'll freaking kill you. Blue tops. One blue top and you'll be flying high. John could see the temptations on Bubbles' face. The boy was eager to join the lines of gaunt, tired petitioners standing against the building, waiting to get the dope they paid for. He could see the plans forming in his eyes, the calculations to get himself another $10 for a possible midnight high. Don't even think about it, he warned. But he knew this was the cost of doing business with a dope fiend. We've got places to be. I didn't do nothing. The fiend protested, raising his hands in the air. Good, you better keep it that way. He could be sinking his fangs into a comely woman's neck, replenishing his reserves and growing in strength. Instead, he had to make sure a drug addict didn't act like a drug addict. There wasn't much he felt buying up the shit-brown pickup truck from a local used car salesman. The shock on his new employee's face when he gave him the keys wasn't as pleasing either. Not with an empty stomach, at least. He was $5,000 poorer, but that was fine. He'll just put it on some dealer's tab. How much money do you make picking up scrap metal on average? He asked the still confused addict, who struggled to give him a straight answer. I really need to feed, John thought, more and more irritated. On a good day, maybe $40. The older man finally answered, scratching his dirty beard. Good. I expect you to make at least 5 times more with this baby. He tapped the ugly but reliable vehicle. Minus the gas and with some margin of error, that's $1,400 every week, 60% of which is mine. The street guy could only look at him with a blank look while he talked about earning sums he couldn't make in months on the streets. And I can't, Bubbles asked. Then you better have a bloody good reason, or I'll assume you're stealing from me, John said plainly. In which case, I would be forced to track you down and rip off your nails one by one, maybe break a few teeth for good measure. You'll also continue working for me until your debt is settled. Then I'll just break your legs, take back my truck, and we'll go our separate ways. He continued, smiling at the increasingly uncomfortable black man. Deal? He asked and got a shaky nod. Deal. John just got himself his first employee and secured a relatively stable and almost legal income of about $700 a week. And life was good. It would be even better if he weren't so hungry. Yup. It's time to pay a Max a little visit. Vampire rule number 8. Always keep and maintain a few blood dolls. Stable blood sources are necessary. It had been 1 week since John started his little conquest of Bubbles and his world. Making the junkie financially and socially dependent on him had been an easy matter. A shitty truck, some human interactions, and just a tiny little bit of presence were all it took to have the coke-thinned, remarkably sharp dope fiend dancing in the palm of his hand. He made sure to meet him every 2 nights. Between a pleasant feeding session with Max or the occasional girl he picks up at a local gym when he's craving some variety in his diet, they'd usually talk business. If business were, Bubbles was complaining about the hardships and obstacles he went through to secure their bread, always exaggerating his tales in order to get some extra brownie points or an attaboy from his not-so-gentle employer. Still, John didn't mind as long as his stomach was full. Cultivating beneficial relationships was key to long-term success, And that meant dealing with people's bullshit with a smile on your face and laughing when appropriate. That damn cop kept me there for 10 whole minutes. I'm telling ya. You white boys sure have it easy round these parts. Bubbles growled at the injustice of the world while driving the pickup truck he so generously lent him. So John gave him a warm, sympathetic smile from his place in the passenger seat. Only fools care about such things, Bubs. Soon you and I will be living a life these worms can only dream of, he said smoothly, earning himself one grateful look and an eager smile from the junkie. I told him not to try playing Hungry's boy like that, but the fool didn't listen to me and ended up getting beat so hard even his whale of a girlfriend wouldn't kiss his black-ass face anymore, Bubbles said with a voice full of mirth, and John laughed, hoping it was indeed appropriate. It wasn't rocket science. He just had to play nice while making it clear that he was capable and willing, if not eager, to hurt him very badly if he so much as considered messing around. Then ever so naturally the discussion drifts off, and Bubbles starts feeding him some actually relevant information. The words of the streets rang in every dope fiend's head. It was almost like a superpower. Let them stand a few hours in some corner, and they'll tell you who works for whom, who's going to get hurt, who shall be doing the hurting, and for whatever stupid reason. The more he listened to Bubbles go on and on about this and that package, the more he understood the structure of the drug market, and the more he realized how little he actually knew. It wasn't some corporate-like, cold business structure with powerful cartels carving up territory and enforcing rules upon the many greedy players. It was a savanna, a wild desert, a concrete jungle where hordes of beasts fueled by money and desire came to live their lives in service of the high. The corner was the oasis, the haven of readily available dope and coke where the ever-so-thirsty fiends gathered to feed their habit like a herd of antelopes stomping and grazing their way to the watering hole. From the depressed white-collar worker driving by every day with $20 in his pocket and so much pain he needs to drown, to the single mother selling her body for a vial, thinking that it was only temporary and that her children were too young to remember anyway, to the career drug addicts, hardcores who live and die by the corner and develop something of a professional pride in their hustle. All the animals, big and small, old and young, came to get that happiness cocktail, hoping it would be as good as that first time, the time their brains changed forever. Every day and every night of every week of their cursed existence. They ignored all dangers. The fiends felt safety from both harm and shame in their numbers. Gotham was a city of millions, and her fiends were in the hundreds of thousands. Gotham has the best drug fiends, John thought, amused. In places with such an abundance of fat, juicy prey, there were bound to be swarms of highly effective predators. Drug dealers, ruling their little kingdoms with fierce reputations and the occasional bout of senseless violence. Others with smaller fangs were content to take advantage of the weak and careless, burn sellers and stash thieves. What's a burn artist? John asked his more streetwise companion when the label came up. Stupid bastards, that's what they are. They put baking soda in vials, then call it dope. Robbing us blind is what they really do. Bubbles answered with distaste and a bit of begrudging respect for those capable of such a good capper. A capper, that's what they called it, not as bad as a crime but not honest work either. A cap was the fiend's hustle. The petty theft and small scams a drug addict will do to get his high. Armed robbery was a crime. Shoplifting was a caper. How else was a fiend to pay a dealer? That's all in the game. John couldn't count the amount of time he heard these words from his employee's mouth. The game wasn't always played this way, though. Even back then in the 60s when heroin conquered the east coast of the United States, turning what was once a small industry confined to hipsters and partygoers and fancy musicians looking for something stronger than vodka into an opportunity to make some serious money. The users went from less than a couple thousand to a real army. Legions paying up in the back alleys and low-income housings, up the towers and behind the clubs and bars. Dealers were businessmen. They maintained distribution networks and provided for them, their people, their muscle and soldiers, and the boys locked up who stayed silent knowing their families would be taken care of. One way or another. Professionals, lethal but not stupid like the fools John raided these last few days, these men had a code. They didn't use what they sold, didn't serve or use children, wouldn't sell to people who didn't know what they were in for, and didn't shoot people who didn't need to be shot. For John, who saw children as young as 10 working as lookouts or even runners for teenage drug dealers, it sounded like fantasy. But it was the truth. People came and went, kingpins rose and fell, but the rules stayed the same. Until Miss Coke showed her pretty arse in town. Heroin meant business. It was the needle piercing a hole to your veins, it was hardcore and pricey, and it was something most people had the sense or fear to avoid on sight. It took a real determined fool to stab himself for a high right off the bat. But the 80s saw the arrival of Jane, the Miss, a much cheaper, friendlier sort of white powder you could shove up your nose to get a few moments of euphoria before it fades and you're going back for more. Those on dope like Bubbles could pretend to be stable, they could do things and buy stuff that didn't necessarily fuel their habit. Sometimes. But Coke was a horrible mistress. It demanded everything and then some, turning a man so mad even the dope fiends were disgusted. Till they tried it and mixed it up with their beloved heroin. Coke brought women to the corners, making it possible for a 15-year-old to grab a vial and tell a friend that his mother would take it up the arse for this much, all the while being completely truthful. It made the hard-to-maintain, limited connection essential to the heroin trade nearly obsolete. Any fool could go to Gotham and buy a package, then deal it back in his hometown, making $1,000 and paying $600 to the suppliers. That meant anyone and everyone could deal. That meant chaos. The professionals became a minority in the game they pioneered. Now 20-something young guns were giving packages to 17-year-olds and making hundreds of thousands of pure benefits every year. The prison was crammed full of people, so much so that arresting someone for street-level distribution became utter madness. The best the cops could do was rough them up and send them to a judge who'd dish out probations and pretrial time served to young men who were effectively shitting gold bars. The streets were full of dealers, the prisons were full of dealers, and no matter how many new cages were built in the city, the county, or the entire state, there would always be 10 times as many dealers working the corners for every last dollar they could provide. Ladies and gentlemen, that's the war on drugs. In every war, information was key, and every day John Harker was getting more and more educated on the subject. Here's your share, 1,500. Bubbles said with big smile, trying to hide his nervousness. But John already knew it was the correct sum. Giving a couple $100 to the employee at the scrapyards was enough to ask a couple favor, like noting the exact amount they paid Bubbles every week. We've made $3,200, right? John said as he counted the bills, not bothering to look up to see the older man's surprised face. He had already seen it enough times. That's all right. Keep up the good work. He knew Bubbles probably shorted him a few dollars, but it didn't matter much. What mattered was letting him know that his actions weren't as discreet as he might think, at least until his first human asset is ready for further development. His freshly bought phone buzzed, breaking the silence. He glanced at the screen and saw Max's name, who happened to be the only person with his contact information. Answering the call, he noticed an unusual silence on her end. "Max, everything all right?" he asked, his voice smooth and reassuring, already suspecting what was about to happen. "We need to talk," she replied, her tone subdued. There they were, the dreadful words. Lesser men would panic and scramble hearing them, with good reasons too. John held back a chuckle. Something like this was bound to happen sooner or later. "Sure thing. Where are you?" "Outside the diner. Can you come?" "I'll be there soon," he promised. As he ended the call, Bubbles shot him a concerned look. "You in trouble, boss?" "Boss? Now that's new," John thought, evaluating the situation. Is he trying to compensate for a possible dishonesty? Nah, nothing unexpected. Vampire rule number 9. A blood doll is a human who freely lets a vampire drink from them. Blood dolls seek a perverse thrill from the vampire's kiss or might entertain an emotional connection. Do not waste such a valuable resource. "Thanks for dropping me off, Bubs." John leaned against the pickup window and gave some parting word to the nervous wreck inside. "We'll have to continue our discussion later. There is still much we have to work through, so stay out of trouble." "No promises," Bubbles joked, but there was hiding the worry in his eyes. "Good luck with your lady friend." "Won't need it." Just like that, He was gone with the rumble of the motor and the manly smell of engine fumes, leaving John Harker alone in Grand Avenue, a couple streets down from Polly's diner and his girl trouble. Some would put it. It all seemed so futile when he knew the kind of issues he'd eventually run into in this messed-up world, or just the demands of the vampire system that played on his greed and lust for power to make him undertake greater and greater tasks. Task. Recruit retainer. Task. Expand your domain. Task. Drink the blood of a metahuman. All of them so much more complicated than dealing with a civilian girl's doubts and insecurities, more subtle than the manipulations needed to absolve someone of their guilty conscience. However, he was the one who chose to make her his blood doll, bulldozing his way into her life, so it was his duty to make it as smooth and pleasant as it could ever be. He walked leisurely, appreciating the city in a less depressing setting than the misery of the East End with its desperate fiends, $10 hookers, and children playing gangster with real guns and real dope. There he found her standing below the flickering neon lights of Polly's diner, for the first time with casual clothes instead of the horrible but somewhat kinky yellow waitress uniform. He liked her better like this, wearing blue jeans and a red flannel shirt under a vintage leather jacket, but somehow along with tasteless, cheap jewelry, but somehow making it work in her favor. He'd like her even without the cigarette on her lips, though. It might have a certain aesthetic, an attractive, restless woman leaning against the wall, trying to conceal her doubts and worries and bracing herself for a painful talk. But that wasn't what he wanted for her. A happy life, John thought, putting words on what he did want for her. I owe her that much. She eventually saw him, but by that time it was already too late. The vampire was upon her. There was nothing a frail human woman like her could do to stop him. Nothing to save her from the public embarrassment of being picked up and twirled like a little girl. She yelped, her cigarette falling down in the process, after which he mercilessly crushed the poison and that horrible fire that made him feel weak and vulnerable and all sorts of things a creature of the night should never be. People are looking, Max hissed to no avail. Let them look, he answered calmly. Lucky for her, he was no Dumbledore. He put her down to appease her half-hearted protests and pleas. She already learned that punches and threats would only make him double down, but he still didn't allow her to leave his arms. Hi there, he whispered, his chin resting on the crown of her hair, knowing full well how much she enjoyed being pampered like this, though she'll never admit it. Hi, she answered in a subdued voice, conflicted between the desire to just give in and let him hold her some more, enjoying his protection from the harsh world out there, or doing the reasonable thing. Reason won in the end, and she stepped out of the embrace before he could decide to slide his fangs into her neck and turn her serious talk into a much more enjoyable one. She stayed there in silence, her plans and rehearsed speech and all the arguments she played in her hands crumbling now that he stood in front of her. You all right? He asked, cupping her cheek as if she were made of glass, and she knew that to him it might as well be the case. John Harker was strong. That was a fact Max understood intimately. Maybe that was why he never showed any concern about his person, any fear. She saw no chink in his armor in all the nights they spent together talking and laughing and doing things that would make her mother puke and wonder what she did wrong to raise such a corny mess of a daughter. Her boyfriend, on the other hand, was all chin and no armor. That might be why she agreed to go out with him. He was such a nice guy. That's what made it all worse. She spent the last week being held and caressed and cajoled by another man. She went on dates and shared secrets and fears and hopes that no one else knew. Not Earl and not the new rich girl gone broke, and certainly not the guy who was supposed to know all this. Things that left her mouth before she could even notice. And if the man in front of her had wanted to, she knew she'd go even further. That was bad. No, she answered truthfully. John deserved the truth. I'm not. I told you I had a boyfriend, but we did what we did, and it's not right. He stayed silent, lips thin, looking at her with those bright blue eyes of his. Those eyes that told her he planned many great things, endured things she couldn't even imagine, and promised her that he could handle all her problems if she just let everything go and became his. We need to stop? She wanted to affirm it, but it came out more like a question, a whimper. "No, we don't," John said with a smile, perfectly relaxed, wiping off tears on her face that she didn't even notice, his grin widening when she couldn't help but lean into his touch. "I'm really sorry, sweetheart. I would have taken care of our little problem earlier if I knew it would bother you so much." He lied through his teeth, acting as if earlier would have been rushed and might have not ended in his favor. Their relationship had to grow beyond a simple emotional affair. She needed to feel the guilt of betraying not only her soon-to-be ex-boyfriend but also her principles. The principles she held dearest, the ones built on spite and disgust at her mother's foolish actions, were that she wouldn't betray her partner and hurt them like the many men Mrs. Black had played and hurt. She had to compromise everything to be with John, and she had to do so willingly, to consider all her options and decide that he was worth more than anything else she might possess. Only then would he swoop in and absolve her of her crimes by showing her that this boyfriend of hers was so much worse, a disgusting and wretched thing, so that she might push all the blame on him and be freed from the emotional burden. Everyone wins at the end except that poor sod. It might be callous, but what did you expect from someone who drinks blood to survive? At least he had the decency to properly seduce and then take care of his blood dolls instead of just taking what he wanted, bleeding them dry, and then throwing them away when they inevitably broke. "Why don't you call him? We'll do things properly this time." John closed the distance and leaned down to kiss her temple. "I don't want to lose what we have." Yes, he will make sure to give her a long, happy life. Vampire rule number 10. Ghouls are your blood-bound servants, nearly as frail as humans yet unflinchingly loyal and capable of doing your bidding during the day. Everyone is a slave, John thought, sitting at his usual spot in the diner under the curious gaze of the few customers and the blonde waitress who took over Max's shift. It might sound cynical, but it was the truth. A man is nothing but a slave who gets to choose his masters. Some grow up to become the slaves of money, waking up every day and going to sleep every night thinking about it, sacrificing their time and energy and whatever morals they value in the name of the dollar. They would laugh and pity those who counted and hoarded each dime instead of using their wealth, not knowing they worshipped the same master. Others were slaves to their desires. They lusted until their eyes went red and their brain rotted, until they could only see skin and flesh and filth. Poor Bubbles was a slave to the needle. He chased that high with religious fervor and treated the corner as his prophet, following its teachings to the letter. Even John was a slave, despite shedding his humanity when he drank that first drop of blood bursting out of his would-be killer's mangled throat. He was the slave of his bloodthirst, the slave of that drive for control and power that shaped every facet of vampiric life from the violent to the most intimate. He might even be the slave of that system and its lures, the sticks and carrots built to make his life as interesting as possible. So what is it so bad that he treated others as property? Bubbles' arms wouldn't be so bloated and covered in abscesses and dead veins if he had been his servant. He would have status and health and a measure of wealth and prosperity 1 week following his orders, and he already had a car and more than $1,000. Soon, even his addiction will be a thing of the past. Max wouldn't need to humiliate herself serving mediocre food to irritating customers. She would live a life of leisure and safety. No more would she worry about money and rent and how to put food on her table. She would be cared for and valued, given all the tender affection and wild passion she desired and the time to pursue her hobbies and dreams. They would have more freedom under his grasp than this greater free world ever allowed them. In that case, wouldn't it be a favor to acquire them? Wouldn't it be an act of kindness and justice? So what if he needed to break someone's bones to make things right for Bubbles? So what if he needed to push Max's boyfriend on a path of self-destruction? The brunette sat beside him, having long since finished her cake, and didn't think twice about stealing bits and pieces of his own chocolate pie. She was still so full of doubt and guilt and that adorable confusion of a lost lamb. But even then her hand was still firmly holding his, as if she feared that he might run off and abandon her like everyone else in her life did. Adorable. He smiled warmly. burning some blood to unleash his presence and give her that feeling of safety and wholesomeness she needed. The ends did justify the means. And if the means gave him the twisted satisfaction of taking someone else's cake, so much the better. The door opened with a ding, alerting the waitress that another client needed serving. But the young lady had a good enough relationship with Max to know that he wasn't here for a midnight meal, so she didn't bother approaching. John smelled him before he could see him, that irritating scent that he worked so hard to remove from his own body, the one that followed Bubbles everywhere he went, the scent of the hood at its lowest. The young man smelled like urine and weed and the days-old vomit that stuck to his baggy clothes like Drake to a middle school. He turned around to see the almost familiar bush of unkempt, dirty blonde hair and that unkempt, uneven stubble. The kid was tall and barely had any meat on his bones. His neck was slightly hunched, and his shoulders sloped forward, giving him the almost zombie-like appearance shared by his fellow jobless, shower-hating music enthusiasts who tried to look like Kurt Cobain. Here he comes, the man of the hour. John's smile only grew. He waved to the poor thing who looked like he just crawled out of a grave. "Come here, Billy." Max seemed transfixed. It had been less than a week since she last saw him, but then he was a lively and excitable guy. Sure, he never was too big on hygiene, and he could do with a better diet and easing down on the weed. But this, Max Black was no fool. She knew what a dope fiend looked like. "William," she muttered. None of this made sense. The woman held onto John's hand for comfort and soon felt his arm warp around her protectively. This didn't make sense either, but at least it was pleasant. It was safe. William Weeks staggered into the diner, his eyes darting around nervously. The few patrons that were present gave him a wide berth, their expressions a mix of pity and disdain. He looked like a man on the edge, every step a struggle. John watched him with a detached interest, his smile never wavering. He took a sip of his coffee, letting the silence stretch until William finally made his way over to their table. There was something uniquely exciting about cuddling a man's girlfriend before his very eyes, and knowing he could not and would not do anything about it. Conan really knew his stuff. It might be the best in life. Well, yes, but the best nonetheless. Then again, he was a vampire. This was just their modus operandi. Unfortunately for Billy, there was no Van Helsing to even the odds. "John," William croaked, his voice barely above a whisper. He glanced at Max, his eyes full of shame and desperation with none of the fury a proper man would muster. I did what you asked. I came as soon as I could." Max's grip on John's hand tightened. She looked between the two men, her eyes wide with confusion. How on earth did the two know each other? She was the one who called him. John's smile grew softer when he kissed her head, whispering sweet nothing and reassurances in her ears. But then he turned to the young man, and his eyes hardened once more. "William here has something he needs to confess. Don't you, Billy?" It must be hell, John thought. Being the third wheel in your own couple, though he'd probably let me take her right in front of him if I promised a vial. William's hands shook as he wrung them together. "Max, I'm so sorry. I've been using heroin, cocaine, couldn't stop. I spent all my money, lost my job, and last week I got caught. Bubbles saw me in Park Row." His voice broke, tears streaming down his face as he rambled on and on. "I'm sorry, it was just too much. The band had trouble and we blew a contract to play in a club. I had to take the edge off somehow, but we wasn't doing it." "Just say it," John said, frowning at the poor guy who almost had a heart attack. That's what happens when you throw your presence around for the sole purpose of intimidation. But it did the trick. William took a deep breath and prepared himself to tell the single most hilarious thing John and nearly everyone at the dinner had heard in a good while. "I got caught giving head to a dealer named Tyrone for a vial," he said in one go. It took all of John's will not to cackle right then and there. Some of the more noisy patrons and the waitress weren't as respectful, though. Max did not gasp or rage or even vomit as John had imagined in the most comical renditions of the conversation. Her face stayed blank, and she asked the shameful man, "What?" He sucked off Tyrone for a vial. "Pay attention, Max." The voice of a man of Slavic descent rang out from the kitchen. William all but fell to his knees, looking at her with pleading eyes. "I didn't want to, Max, I swear, but I couldn't stop." Bubbles said he knew someone who could help, that his boss always found a way to get people the help they needed. "That's how I met John, but he said he liked you and told me to come clean. He said he'd help me if I told you everything." He didn't mention that Bubbles was given $300 to follow him that day, but that wasn't something he knew in the first place. Max turned to John, her eyes filled with confusion. John's smile turned colder. William needed to face the consequences of his actions, and now he has. William reached out, trying to grab onto John's shoulders, but promptly retreated when the younger man glared at him. "Please, John, you promised. You said you'd help me." He did do that. It wasn't hard convincing a man who lost everything. John looked down at him with a mixture of pity and disdain. "I said I'd help you if you told Max the truth, and you did. But I never promised you drugs or money, William. Your addiction is your own to deal with." William's face crumpled, and he let out a choked sob. "Please, I have nothing left. I'll do anything." John's gaze flickered with a brief spark of amusement. "I can't give you money, Billy, but I can give you a job, a chance to get clean." Max watched the exchange, her emotions a whirlwind of anger, sadness, and confusion. She couldn't believe what was happening. She had known William was struggling, but she had no idea it was this bad. And John had already planned all of this, from the day they met, when he promised he would take care of her. Something she dismissed as mere sweet talk when the night ended and she returned to her dull, exhausting life. It wasn't, she thought almost fondly. He wasn't lying. Bubbles worked for John. She knew he hauled around scrap for him, so he rode around the city all day long. But there was no way he just stumbled onto William. John put him up to it. He put a tail on her junkie of a boyfriend. On one hand, she wouldn't have known otherwise. On the other, it all felt so cold, so calculated. She didn't know how to feel about it. "Everything will be all right, William," John said. That meant William should probably run and never look back. But junkies weren't known for their good judgment. William slowly got to his feet, swaying slightly. "What do I do now?" John's smile returned, a predatory glint in his eyes. "That's up to you. You've hit rock bottom, William. You can either stay there or claw your way back up. Bubbles will drop you off to Brideshead. Meet me there in 3 hours, or I'll just assume you're no longer interested." William nodded, his shoulders slumped in defeat. He turned to Max, his eyes filled with tears. "I'm so sorry, Max. I never meant to hurt you, but I think it's best if we stop seeing each other." Max looked at him, but there was no heartbreak. They were done just like that. William stumbled out of the diner, heading for Bubbles' shit-brown pickup, the snake inside whispering ways he could get $10 and buy a vial while waiting for his new boss. And just like that, he was gone from her life. Max turned to John. There were hundreds of questions in her mind, but only a single one mattered. "Why?" John reached out to take her hand, his expression softening. "I knew you'd feel guilty leaving him, and I just couldn't stand letting you suffer like this." She tried to pull away, but his grip was too strong, and those eyes of his showed too much care. Soon all she could think about was him and his touch and the lengths he would go to make sure she was all right. Their lips joined for a moment, and then another, and another until that voice that told her they were in public and shouldn't act this way was gone, replaced by another stating that she was now single and free to do as she pleased. She was gasping for air by the time they parted, her face flushed and lips puffed, but John didn't seem constrained by the same limits. He just went kissing his way from cheeks to her chin until he reached her neck. Max felt him kissing and sucking. The slight pain of the hickey was drowned by the ecstasy that followed. It wasn't supposed to feel this good. What little sense was left in her wondered what it would feel like to go all the way, if a mere kiss was enough to make her give herself euphoria. She barely remembered him stopping and holding her close. The envious or appalled looks from the few customers were not remembered, nor did she remember getting into a cab and holding on to John as if he were a body pillow. But she did, and soon her key was opening the door of her small apartment. This day started with her stifling tears when she decided that stopping this was the right thing to do and not welcoming him into her home. Yes, John Harker was determined to subvert all her expectations. Vampire rule number 11. A vampire is only as good as his retainers. Nurture and refine them into proper tools, for every stain and mistake of theirs might result in your final death. Oh, John Harker was no fool. He might not be nearly as much of a stone-cold, heartless monster as he'd like to be, but he was still far from the kind of naive buffoon who could ignore reality even as it flipped them the middle finger. Working with a junkie was not sustainable. No matter how good a job Bubbles was doing, no matter how street-savvy and well-versed an informant he was, no matter his relative honesty and loyalty to him, he was still an addict. Worse than that, he was an addict who happened to be intimately familiar with most of John's ventures, one who was too bright not to have at least some insight into his immediate goals after so much time spent working under him. That made him a weakness, the most obvious vulnerability in John Harker's otherwise ironclad armor. The kind of weakness one must purge mercilessly. That's what the vampire told himself as he entered Bubbles' shit-brown truck. It had barely been 2 weeks since he got him that car, and it was already halfway through paying for itself. Yes, Bubbles was an efficient worker. "Hi there, boss man," the older man said with a mock salute, a cheeky smile on his face. John took a second to study his appearance. He still had the gaunt cheeks and bloodshot eyes of a bona fide drug addict, but his clothes were clean, and he got something for the scars and abscesses that used to cover his skin. Convincing him to see a doctor was a hard task, but a necessary one. John couldn't let some miserable-looking wretch represent him in the street now. Could he? "Evening, Bubs." His greeting was more tame, but he reckoned that anything warmer would be in bad taste given his plans for the night. As for Bubbles, he quickly caught on to the solemn mood. He didn't like it, though. He didn't know how to deal with it. The streets were all fake cheer and bravado, with the occasional bout of horror. He was in foreign waters. "Where we going?" "Off to see your lady friend." He tried to lighten the mood. "Nah, we're gonna meet someone at Widows Avenue, 2 streets down from the old Solomon Wayne courthouse," John said, and for a moment Bubbles relaxed. This was business, so it was a good thing. He could deal with John when he was in business mode. "Then we'll have that talk," he continued, and the poor man's heart dropped. Having a talk was never a good thing. He remembered vividly the discussions John had with that foolish, thieving dope fiend, making his life more difficult than it already was, as if he needed more trouble. Or his little chat with Gary, who tried to threaten his way into a share in the scrap hustle they've got going. Bubbles gulped. Gary had never been the same since that day. "Solomon Wayne. That's in Park Row. You aren't planning to do me in Crime Alley, are you?" Bubbles laughed, half joking but mostly making sure he would survive the night, yet only got a strange look. "No, of course not," John said with his usual smile, the one that said that everything was going to be fine. For him, at least. Yeah, Bubbles wasn't feeling too good about this Park Row business. Part of him wanted to just open the door and run away as fast as he could, but he knew this wasn't an option. The last 2 weeks working for John Harker were the easiest, smoothest ones he'd had in a long time. He can't give that up. Also, he was fairly certain that John would catch him and break his legs if he did, so there was that. All right. He turned the key and heard the engine roar. Its rumbling was the only sound in the car for the entire ride. Driving through Park Row was like peeking at the gates of hell. There was no fire and brimstone, but the damned were present, the despair everywhere. To John's enhanced sense, it was even more true. Brideshead was the hood. It was the housing projects and rundown buildings and vacant houses turned into drug stashes to feed the heroin business. It was born of desire and greed, 2 very understandable things. But the Park Row District, or Crime Alley as literally everyone also calls it, it was different. It was just evil. Every minute, a child screams in terror, a man is beaten to death, and a woman is assaulted just because someone could. No greed, no drug money. No one pretending there was a game being played or the illusion of rules and fairness. Only violence, the people who reveled in it, and those caught in the quagmire. That was crime alley, senseless murder. For Bubbles, it was much simpler. As long as John didn't tell him to stop the car and get out, he was a happy man. Things got better when they approached the old courthouse. By the time they reached Widows Avenue, the kill-me atmosphere had subsided. Turn left. John guided him to their destination, still unwilling to just tell him where he wanted to go. That's the place. Let's go. Wait, am I coming too? Bubbles asked and had half a mind to just press on the pedal and drive away. But the younger man was already outside and opened his door, grabbing his shoulder with that iron grip of his. Of course you are, John said calmly. They arrived at the building, a place that looked run down but functional. Bubbles followed John inside, his eyes darting around, trying to make sense of their destination. When he saw the sign for Gotham Narcotics Anonymous, his confusion deepened. This sure ain't the best place to put down a buddy, he thought, looking at the crowd of addicts seeking help. Some of them came willingly, some had to come here to avoid jail time, and others were brought by friends and family. He even recognized some faces from Brideshead. John led him to a seat, and they sat down, listening to people's stories. A young girl who went from one vial with her friends to taking multiple men at once to pay for her habit. An old man, a regular addict who spent decades on the needle yet survived to tell the tale, just because he got lucky. A tattooed biker guy, with all the bulging muscles and glorious beard and leather clothes one could expect, was scary as hell till he started talking. Then folks realized he was the most wholesome fella in the whole building. As Bubbles absorbed the testimonies, he began to understand what John wanted from him. The tales of redemption and change were moving, but Bubbles couldn't see himself in them. He didn't think he had the strength or the will to follow that path. He loved getting high. Are you sure? A small voice whispered in his brain, and he did his best not to think about all the things he's done to get that blast, all the bridges he's burned. The meeting wrapped up, and Bubbles stood up more than ready to leave. But John was right behind him, a look of disappointment etched on his face. It's time for you to make a choice, Bubbles, John said, his voice low and commanding. You can continue living like a rat in the streets, or you can become something bigger, something you can be proud of. John's presence washed over Bubbles, a powerful, almost tangible force. It wasn't just Bubbles who felt it. The entire room seemed to be under John's spell, their eyes fixed on him with a mixture of awe and reverence. Such was the power of the blood. I'll try, Bubbles stammered, feeling the weight of the vampire's gaze. John's expression hardened. There's no try, Bubbles. You either do it or you don't. Make a decision. Bubbles felt a surge of conflicting emotions. The fear of losing his current life battled with the hope of becoming something better. John's presence intensified, and Bubbles felt an overwhelming urge to please him, to live up to the expectations that had been placed upon him. But it wasn't enough until his dope-fiend mind remembered. Until he remembered all the beatings he took, all the money he blew, and all the people's hurt. How his only living relatives, his sister and his niece, were now strangers to him because he couldn't resist, because he was a slave to that needle. All the time he tried to quit, only to fail and return to his old way. But now he wasn't alone. So maybe, just maybe, it could all work out. I'll do it, Bubbles finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. John's expression softened, a hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Good. There's a 28-day program here. You'll start tomorrow. The next morning, Bubbles walked into the program, still riding the high of the previous night's events. The journey to recovery was just beginning, and despite his doubts, he was determined to see it through. For John, for himself, and for the future he dared to dream of. The days in the program were a blur of therapy sessions, group meetings, and solitary reflections. Bubbles struggled at first, the cravings for his old life gnawing at him. But John's words echoed in his mind, and the memory of John's presence gave him strength. Each day, he felt a little stronger, a little more in control. He started to see glimpses of the future John had painted for him. A future where he wasn't just surviving, but thriving. By the end of the 28 days, Bubbles emerged from the program a changed man. He was still the same in many ways, but he was no longer a slave to his addiction. He had a purpose, a direction, and the unwavering support of John Harker. As he walked out of the building, he saw John waiting for him, leaning against the hood of his baby, the shit-brown, ugly-ass pickup truck that changed his life. Bubbles approached, a mixture of gratitude and determination in his eyes. "Thank you, John," he said, his voice steady. "I couldn't have done it without you." John nodded, a proud smile on his face. "You did well, Bubbles. Now let's get to work. We've got a lot to do." Bubbles felt a renewed sense of purpose as he climbed into the car. He wasn't just an addict anymore. He was a man with a future, a man who had taken control of his destiny. "No," he shook his head. "Name's Reginald." And he knew that, with John by his side, there was nothing he couldn't achieve. As for John, his mind was preoccupied with other matters. After all, he has been very, very busy in Bubbles. In Reginald's absence. Task completed. First retainer obtained. Reward, 10 EXP. Ability, Ghoul Familiar. Vampire Rule number 12. The best among the vampires are those who are thanked and applauded by the very people they consume. John Harker leaned against the brick wall of a dilapidated building, his hands tucked casually into the pockets of his leather jacket. He could hear the faint mumbles of business transactions, the quick exchange of cash for baggies, and the occasional nervous laughter that punctuated the night. Every minute, someone got high, someone got scammed, someone got done. This was an open-air drug market, one of many poisoning the blood that might otherwise sustain him, and tonight he was on a mission. John had a clear objective in mind. He needed to know how deep the rot went, how many corners these parasites had infected, and just how much muscle they could muster when threatened. If he was to cleanse Brideshead, he needed to understand the scale of the infestation first. Bubbles had given him a solid idea, but it was still only from the dope fiend's point of view, the front of the operation, so to speak. It was all good if he wanted to raid some corner stash houses. Easy business, breaking a few bones and going him with a couple grand and some bags of dope he had no use for. Standard stick-up activities are the kind of problems drug dealers expect, accept, and endure easily as a cost of doing business. They might put out a bounty if they knew who did the hit, which was useless in his case since he didn't bother selling the drugs. The smarter ones started rotating the drugs and money more often while getting muscle in the houses. That means that it was as effective in culling the drug trade as the GCPD's occasional operation. It didn't mean shit. If he wanted to actually do something about it, then he had to aim much higher. Why though? Why go out of his way to damage the drug trade? Wouldn't it be better to let them operate freely and then come back to mow the grass and make a few $1,000 every once in a while? The answer was fairly simple. From the very moment John woke up in East End and decided to hang around, the prosperity and peace of mind of the drug dealers were doomed. It was a natural conclusion. A vampire feeds on blood and craves power. Drug dealers hoard power and spoil the blood. How could the two ever coexist? One of them had to flee or be crushed, and John had no intention of cowering and seeking greener pastures because a bunch of fools on a drug-fueled power trip were too much for him to handle. Not to mention how lucrative it would be to take over the assets of so many groups, without needed to worry about the costs of making business. He thought, his mind already giving him ideas to launder and invest the money. He moved silently, slipping from one vantage point to another. His senses, enhanced by his vampiric nature, picked up every whispered conversation, every furtive exchange of money for poison. The dealers operated with an arrogant confidence, as if they believed themselves untouchable. And in a sense, they were right. The police couldn't do anything. The bat was too focused on the big players and freaks to try and clean up the corners. Not to mention the fact that he never beat on children the way he battered the adults playing the same game. Capes always made a point of avoiding the ugly reality of the streets. It was so much easier to break a grown man's bones, after all. Without an obvious predator, the dealers were free to grow as big and fat as they wished, only keeping an eye out for the crooked or incompetent cops or the rival gangs. John couldn't help but smirk at their ignorance. They had no idea that they were being watched, studied by something far more dangerous than the police or rival gangs. Each corner had its own crew, a motley assortment of lowlifes who thought themselves kings of the block. The vampire counted them, noting the way they interacted and the pecking order among them. The ground stashes were the easiest to spot. Small amounts of drugs hidden in the most convenient of places, ready to be ditched at the first sign of trouble. He didn't care much for them. Stealing ground stashes was a caper, a drug fiend's game. The corner stashes were better protected, but even there, John saw the holes in their defenses. He had raided a good dozen in his short stay here, seeing them go from a couple idiots playing guard to half a dozen fools with small guns and lots of bravado. Raiding one was taking away a few days' worth of money and drugs, a week at best, nothing they couldn't make up in a few days. It was the main stashes that really interested him, though. The places where the real money was kept, where the big players hung out, and where the drugs were cut and packaged. These were the fortresses, hidden behind the facades of legitimate businesses. A strip club here, a gentleman's bar there. John knew that these places were more than just drug dens. They were the command centers, the heart of the operation. He spent hours moving from one location to another, cataloging every detail, every weakness. The more he saw, the more confident he became. These dealers were complacent, lazy even. They had grown fat and slow, believing themselves safe in their little empire. But John knew better. He knew that in a city like Gotham, safety was an illusion, and empires could crumble overnight. As the night wore on, the bloodsucker returned to the center of Brideshead, his mind racing with possibilities. He had seen enough to know that the local drug crews were vulnerable, ripe for the picking. But he also knew that he couldn't rush this. He needed to be methodical and precise. A blitzkrieg was only effective if it was overwhelming, and for that, he needed more power. The vampire system has been a great tool, reliable, and gave him the opportunity to grow with each achievement, each bite in the neck of a worthy prey. Maintaining a proper feeding habit, completing the tasks, and diligent exploitation of what he had availed him some solid growth. Level 4. Name, Jonathan Harker. Age, 16. Titles, Crack House Resident, Jailbait. Race, Vampire, Fledgling. Blood points, 270/400. EXP, 17 out of 80. Still, it wasn't enough. His mind drifted to the hunger gnawing at the edges of his consciousness. It was always there, a constant reminder of what he was and what he needed to survive. The bloodthirst, the power it promised. He would feed tonight, but not just on any blood. He had standards, after all. Virgins, healthy, competent women, and those who intrigued him, those were the ones he favored. The blood of addicts, drunks, and prostitutes was tainted and polluted. He wouldn't lower himself to that level. But first, he needed to finish his reconnaissance. There were still a few more places he wanted to check out before the night was over. He slipped into the shadows once more, his eyes scanning the streets for anything he might have missed, or the presence of a nosy bat, something he has avoided so far. The more he observed, the more certain he became that this was the right move. These gangs, these so-called soldiers, were nothing more than parasites feeding off the misery of the people. That was something only he had the right to do. John's lips curled into a cold smile as he thought about what was to come. He had seen enough. Now it was time to feed. He needed more power if he was going to take on the drug dealers and their so-called soldiers. They had numbers, weapons, and territory. John had himself. But that was enough, or it would be once he'd fed. His first stop was Max's apartment. Max Black, the feisty waitress who'd caught his eye, was someone special. Max had stopped smoking, partly because he'd made her, but also because she wanted to please him, even if she wouldn't admit it. She would also stop working and spend more time taking care of herself if he had it his way. But that would come later. He slipped into her apartment like a shadow, silent and unseen. If he did the same thing while being ugly, it would be a horror show, but pretty privilege was a thing, and there was no doubt that many a girl out there fantasized about being his glorified sandwich. Max was asleep, her dark hair splayed out on the pillow, her breathing soft and steady. Johnny moved closer. Even without unleashing his presence, he could still affect her, stirring something deep within her even in sleep. She shifted, a soft sigh escaping her lips as he leaned over her, his eyes locked on the pulse beating in her neck. He could hear her heart beating, her warm blood flowing. He could even smell it. John didn't rush. He took his time, savoring the moment. His hand brushed against her skin, and she stirred again, her eyes fluttering open. There was no fear in her gaze, only a sleepy confusion that quickly turned to something else as she recognized him. "Johnny," she murmured, her voice thick with sleep. "Shoo," he whispered, his voice smooth, almost hypnotic. "Just relax, Max." She did, her body going limp at his command. Even without presence or supernatural domination, she obeyed blindly and earnestly. The perfect blood doll. John bent down, his lips brushing against her neck, just above the artery. The hunger flared inside him, but he held it back, controlling it with iron will. When he bit down, it wasn't a savage act. It was gentle, almost tender, his fangs sliding into her skin. Max gasped, her hands gripping the sheets as the pleasure hit her. John fed slowly, drawing out the experience for both of them. Her blood was rich, vibrant, filling him with a warmth that spread through his entire body. Blood points, 330/400, plus 3 EXP points. He could feel the power surging within him, his senses sharpening, his muscles tightening. But it wasn't just physical strength he gained. There was something more, something deeper. It was like drinking in her essence, her life force, and it made him stronger and more complete with every gulp. When he finally pulled away, Max was breathless, her eyes half closed, a blissful smile on her lips. John licked the last traces of blood from his lips, savoring the taste. "You did good, Max," he said softly, brushing a strand of hair away from her face. "Get some rest." She mumbled something incoherent, already drifting back to sleep as he slipped out of the apartment, leaving her with only the memory of the pleasure and the rapidly fading marks on her neck. His saliva could close the wounds his fangs caused and helped prevent an infection. It was rather fortunate, or hunting would be much more complicated. One feeding wasn't enough. John needed more, much more, if he was going to take on the drug dealers and cleanse Brideshead. He moved through the night, hunting with a purpose. He knew where to find his prey, his usual hunting spots, the places where he could find the kind of blood he needed. He avoided the addicts, the drunks, the ones whose blood was tainted by their vices. John had no interest in feeding on filth. Instead, he sought out those who were pure, or as close to pure as one could find in Gotham. Virgins, healthy women, those who had something to offer beyond just their blood. They were harder to find, but that only made the hunt more satisfying. His next target was a young woman he'd been watching for a while. She worked at a small boutique in Gotham Heights, a place untouched by the worst of the city's corruption. She was pretty, in a quiet way, with a shy smile and a reserved demeanor. John had seen her around and noticed the way she carried herself and the way she interacted with others. She was intelligent and cautious, the kind of woman who didn't take risks. But tonight, she had taken a risk. She had stayed late at the boutique, working after hours, alone. John had been waiting for this opportunity, and now it was here. He approached her as she was locking up, stepping out of the shadows with a disarming smile. She startled at first, but his presence, his aura, put her at ease. They talked for a few minutes, the vampire charming her with practiced ease. He almost felt bad for her. When he made his move, It was quick, almost too quick for her to notice. One moment they were talking, and the next, she was in his arms, her head tilted to the side as he sank his fangs into her neck. The shock of it made her tense, but the pleasure that followed melted her resistance away. John fed deeply, his hunger driving him, but he was careful not to take too much. He didn't want to hurt her, didn't want to leave her weak or drained. He took just enough to sate the hunger, to feel the power surge through him, and then he pulled away, leaving her dazed and disoriented. "Thank you," he whispered, pressing a kiss to her forehead before disappearing into the night. He continued like this, moving from one target to the next, each feeding bringing him closer to the power he needed. By the time he was done, the night was almost over, and John was filled with a power unlike anything he'd felt before. Level 4. Name: Jonathan Harker. Age 16. Titles: Crack House Resident, Jailbait. Race: Vampire, Fledgling. Blood points: 400/400. EXP: 88 out of 80. Level up. With a single thought, he felt his insides turn and his veins burn as if someone had poured molten steel within them. Something unlike his previous level-ups, something greater. In a few seconds, the pain left, leaving behind nothing but a feeling of increased physical power. He had reached a new milestone in his life as a humanoid mosquito. Level 5. Name: Jonathan Harker. Age 16. Titles: Crack House Resident, Jailbait. Race: Vampire, Fledgling. Blood points: 400/800. EXP: 0/200. He was ready to take on the dealers, to cleanse Brideshead, and to claim his territory. The next phase of his plan was about to begin. Well, you can still be destroyed, but forget the books and the movies. Garlic is worthless. Across? Shove it right up their ass. Ha 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 ha. A steak? Only if it catches you in the heart, and then it just paralyzes you. Runnin' water? That's no problem. I bathe occasionally. Now a shotgun blast to the head? Oh, that's trouble, boy. Fire? That's real trouble. Sunlight? Well, you catch a sunrise and it's all over, kiddo. Get it? Wisdom from a jolly bloodsucker. Oh. John knew the streets of Brideshead like the back of his hand. He'd spent weeks scoping out every corner, every alley, every damn crack in the pavement where the scum of the city hid their dirty business. He wasn't just some bloodsucker out for a midnight snack. He was a hunter, and these streets were his hunting grounds. After feeding and leveling up, the thirst was sated, but the hunger for more power still gnawed at him. He was ready to tear through the filth that had taken root in his neighborhood. The dealers, the thugs, the so-called soldiers, they thought they owned Brideshead. They poisoned its people. They maimed and slayed his cattle. Tonight, John was going to show them just how wrong they were. It started with a tip-off, an exchange set to go down at a corner stash just past midnight. One of Hungry's guys, a lieutenant in charge of this particular crew, was one of the more cautious types, the kind who didn't let his boys get too comfortable. He rotated locations, kept the deals short and quick, and always made sure to be on the move. But no one could stay off John's radar for long. He perched on a rooftop, hidden in the shadows, watching the street below like a hawk. The stash was hidden in plain sight, a viable alternative to the usual vacant house. A busted-up phone booth with a false bottom, a garbage can with a hollowed-out interior. It didn't matter. The real action was what happened around it, the comings and goings of the corner boys, the muscle lurking nearby, and the lieutenant who orchestrated it all. Sure enough, he spotted the man in charge, a wiry fella with a slick, greasy look about him. He moved with the nervous energy of someone who knew he was in a dangerous business but wasn't quite sure how to get out. The guy had half a dozen men with him, each one armed, though they tried to keep it subtle. A couple of Glocks tucked into waistbands, a shotgun hidden under a ratty jacket. Now that's troublesome. Unless you were some Superman kind of guy, a shotgun blast to the face will always be a bad experience. Fortunately for him, the man on the other side of the barrel was big, green, and squishy. John couldn't help but smirk. They had no idea what was coming. The exchange was quick. The lieutenant handed off a small duffel bag, probably stuffed with cash, while his guy passed over a package wrapped in brown paper. It was a smooth transaction, efficient even, but John didn't care about the deal itself. He was after the bigger fish. This kind of transfer is routine. Give the corner boys a new package and take your share of the profits back home, the vampire thought, getting himself ready. He put on his game face. He was dressed in all black with a hood large enough to cast a shadow over his face to protect his identity, though he knew that a bit of presence and showing off his burning red eyes would be enough to craft a separate image from the charming, playful John Harker. As the crew started to disperse, the lieutenant gave a nod to his men, signaling them to take the stash back to their corner. It was then that John made his move. He dropped down from the rooftop, landing silently in the alley. The lieutenant was already heading back to his car, a beat-up sedan that looked like it had seen better days. John slipped through the shadows, his footsteps soundless on the pavement, until he was right behind the man. The lieutenant never saw him coming. John's hand shot out, grabbing him by the throat and slamming him against the car with enough force to dent the door. The man's eyes bulged in shock, his hands scrabbling at John's grip, but it was like trying to move steel. "Where do you think you're going?" John hissed, his voice low and cold. The lieutenant gurgled something incomprehensible, his eyes wide with fear. John loosened his grip just enough to let him speak. What the hell? Who the hell are you?" The man stammered, his voice shaky. "Doesn't matter. What matters is you're going to take me to your boss." His red eyes shone even brighter under his hood. The man's eyes darted around, looking for the crew, but they were too far away, already heading down the block. John could see the panic setting in, the realization that he was utterly alone with a predator he couldn't hope to fight off. "You've got two choices," John continued, his voice as calm as ever. "Take me to your boss, or I start tearing apart your little operation piece by piece until there's nothing left but blood and dust." The lieutenant hesitated, and for a moment, John thought he might try to fight back. But then the man's shoulders slumped in defeat, and he nodded weakly. All right, I'll take you. Just don't kill me, man." John smiled, a cold, predatory grin that showed just a hint of fong. "Good choice. Now drive." The ride to the main stash was tense. The lieutenant kept glancing at John in the rearview mirror, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. John didn't say a word, just stared out the window, already planning his next move. Of course, his 9mm was pressed against the driver's seat, business end pointed right at his new friend's spine, just in case his balls got bigger and overthrew his brain's rule. "I'm out. I'll take my money and go back to Texas." The game got too fierce nowadays. He heard the relatively old man, at least in his profession, mumble under his breath. "Yes, that would be a smart idea," he answered honestly, but his driver didn't think much of his advice. Or maybe he did. John couldn't tell. The poor guy just flinched and kept driving in complete silence this time. "That's pretty rude," he thought, shaking his head in disapproval. The main stash was exactly what he expected. A rundown strip club on the edge of Brideshead. The kind of place that looked as shady as all hell and was seedy in more than one way, but still pulled in a decent crowd thanks to the cheap booze and cheaper thrills. It was the perfect front for a drug operation. The bouncers at the door gave the lieutenant a nod as they passed, not even bothering to search him or his guest. It was a sign of just how secure they felt in their little kingdom. But their arrogance would be their downfall. Once inside, John could feel the tension in the air. The place was packed with muscle. Dozens of guys, all armed to the teeth, were lounging around as if they owned the world. The lieutenant led him through the club, past the bar, and into the back room where the real action was. 7 pistols, 3 assault rifles for shotguns, and a bunch of baseball bats, knives, and knuckle dusters. The vampire counted in less than a second, choosing the most fitting among the many plans of attack he had prepared. Hungry was there too, surrounded by his best soldiers. He was a large man, built like a tank, with a bald head and a thick gold chain around his neck. The kind of guy who looked like he could break bones with his bare hands, and probably had on more than one occasion. He favored the melee, judging by his scarred knuckles, though he still had a large revolver within arm's reach. "Frankie, who the hell is this?" the boss growled as John and the lieutenant entered. Boss, this is the guy who's been causing trouble," the lieutenant stammered, trying to keep his voice steady. Before he could finish, John moved. It was like a blur of motion, a speed that no human could match. He grabbed the nearest thug with a shotgun, twisting his arm behind his back with a sickening crack, then used him as a meat shield as the others scrambled to draw their weapons. The room exploded into chaos. The thugs fired off shots, but John was already on the move, darting between them with supernatural agility. He could feel the power coursing through him, the strength that came from his recent feeding, from leveling up. His fists were like hammers, breaking bones and crushing jaws with every strike. "Damn this, I'm getting out of here," his driver said, running away without looking back amidst the confusion. "Bye, Frankie," he called while neutralizing the last of the shotgun men with a brutal kick right on the liver. He grabbed the metal weapon and threw it at a shooter who was a bit too accurate for his taste. Crunch. Arg. His target whimpered on the floor after his skull had a nice meeting with the heavy gun. The handgun fire that might have torn a normal man to shreds barely slowed him down, and he was much too fast for the riflemen to spray him without butchering their own friends and brothers. The few wounds he sustained were healed almost instantly, and he still had more than enough blood in his reserves to unleash a dreadful presence upon his helpless enemies. He used the fear to his advantage, letting the terror spread through the room like wildfire. The men started to panic, shooting wildly, hitting more of their own than they did him. The vampire was unwilling to personally kill anyone just yet. Getting caught by this or that vigilante was still a risk, so he'd rather keep the "I am justice" card just in case. However, it didn't mean he had to save them from themselves. John focused on their boss, the big man who had once seemed so imposing. Now he was just another target. Hungry swung at him, a meaty fist aimed at John's head, but John ducked under it with ease, then drove his elbow into the man's ribs with enough force to crack them. However, he wasn't a boss for nothing. The enraged criminal all but shrugged it off, instead aiming his large revolver right at John's hooded head, ready to take the shot. A weapon of this caliber would take a pound of flesh, and he was a bit too close to evade all 6 shots without taking chances, so John burned some blood to activate his blood buff for the very first time in battle. The explosive increase in speed was all it took to close the distance between them before he could even press the trigger. John punched him right in the stomach with so much force both he and the gun were sent flying in different directions. In his earth, the gangster would be a peak athlete with the strength, speed, and durability he displayed. But here, he was just a common brute. Hungry staggered, gasping for breath. But John didn't give him a chance to recover. He grabbed the man by the collar, lifting him off his feet as if he weighed nothing, then slammed him into the wall. The boss's eyes were wide with fear, the bravado gone in an instant. Please don't kill me," the boss wheezed, his voice trembling. John leaned in close, his eyes glowing with a cold, predatory light. "I'm not here to kill you," he said, his voice dripping with menace. "Not yet. First, I'm going to take everything you've got. Then I'll let you live long enough to see your empire crumble." He dropped the battered and bruised boss to the floor, leaving him gasping for air until a foot on his face sent him to the land of dreams. The rest of the thugs were either unconscious, wounded, or too terrified to fight back. John walked through the room, picking up the duffel bags filled with cash and drugs, grabbing a few guns for good measure, and stuffing them into his coat. He scattered the rest of the drugs, crack, dope, and coke around the home, making it unfit for consumption. He checked for cameras, but even thugs had the sense not to record a criminal conspiracy. As he left the strip club, he felt a grim satisfaction. The first step in his plan was complete. He had taken down one of the biggest players in Brideshead, and he'd done it without breaking a sweat. The sound of sirens coming to the worst neighborhood in all of Gotham was the cherry on top. But he wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. John returned to his apartment, the spoils of his raid hidden beneath his coat. His place still wasn't much to look at. A relatively clean crack house was a crack house nonetheless, but it served its purpose. He didn't need luxury for the moment. He needed privacy, a place where he could lay low and plan his next move. He stashed the cash and weapons in the bathroom, making sure everything was secure. The duffel bag felt heavier than before, not because of the money or the guns, but because of the significance of what he'd just done. He'd made a statement, a loud, violent statement, that Brideshead was no longer under the control of petty thugs and dealers. It was his territory now. But John wasn't naive. He knew that taking down one gang wouldn't be enough. The others would see what had happened and either come after him or go into hiding. Either way, he needed to act fast before they had a chance to regroup. He wasn't too worried about being targeted. He was essentially a ghost for all intents and purposes. He didn't sell dope, didn't flaunt wealth, and didn't hang out with any crowd save for a dope fiend, and people just ignored those folks. John didn't get out in the day either, when most of the spying and gossiping, intel gathering took place. So he was safe from the wrath of those he robbed. He stepped back out into the night, his mind already working on the next target. He needed to track down the remaining gangs, find their main stashes, and hit them where it hurt. It wouldn't be easy. Each gang had its own network of hideouts, muscle, and connections, but John had something they didn't. He had the element of surprise, and he had the power that came from feeding. He was a vampire. They never stood a chance. Vampire rule number 13. Only eat people when it's on your terms. A stranger asking to be bitten is as much a trap as a Astolfo. A few days ago, he was walking around the streets with Bubbles, being told tall tales about Hungry's crew and how they won their corners with lead and violence. Now he stood in his crack house surrounded by their ill-gotten money. Hungry's crew bleeding and most likely getting arrested after the single worst night of their gangster careers. But tonight wasn't over. He had more work to do. John locked up his spoils and left the apartment, disappearing into the night like the monster he truly was, and not a constipated disco ball looking for his soulmate. The first gang had been a challenge, but he wasn't one to back down. If anything, the success of his first raid had only fueled his hunger for more. He moved swiftly, his senses heightened as he made his way to the next target. The possibility of encountering the bat was still keeping him on edge, but it might be a good thing. Kept him on his toes and honed his perception. The second gang John had in mind was holed up in a joint on the south side, a place that was known for its flashy lights and thumping bass. But beneath the surface, it was just as dirty as the rest of Brideshead. The gang used the place as their base of operations, with a stash hidden somewhere in the back. John slipped into the alley behind the bar, listening to the muffled music and the occasional shout from a bouncer. He could hear the voices of a few gangbangers near the back door, talking and laughing, completely unaware that they were being watched. "Man, I tell ya, the boss is paranoid as hell," one of them said, taking a drag from his cigarette. "He's been jumpy all night, like he's expecting someone to come bustin' through the door." "Can you blame him?" another replied. "Heard some freak took out Hungry's crew earlier. We're talking the whole stash. Gone. Just like that." "No way, man. That's just some bullshit to scare us. Ain't nobody crazy enough to hit us here. This place is locked down tight." "Yeah, you're probably right. Who'd be stupid enough to mess with us?" John couldn't help but smirk as he listened to their banter. The irony was too good. He crept closer, staying out of sight as he moved along the wall. The door was just ahead, slightly ajar, and the two thugs were standing right next to it. He picked up a small pebble from the ground and tossed it down the alley, causing it to clatter against a dumpster. The sound was enough to make the thugs jump. They both turned in the direction of the noise, their hands moving toward their weapons. What the hell was that? Probably just a rat or something. This place is full of them. Well, go check it out. I'm not taking any chances. The first thug reluctantly moved toward the sound, his gun at the ready. John waited until the man was a few steps away from the door before he made his move. He darted forward, silent and quick, grabbing the second thug from behind and clamping a hand over his mouth. The man struggled, but John's grip was ironclad. He dragged him into the shadows, knocking him out with a precise blow to the back of the head. The first thug turned around just in time to see his buddy disappear into the darkness. His eyes went wide, and he fumbled for his gun. But John was on him before he could shoot, scream, or make a fuss. A quick punch to the gut left the thug gasping for air, and John followed up with a swift kick to the knee, sending the man crashing to the ground. "Who's there?" the thug wheezed, trying to scramble back to his feet. John leaned in close, his voice a low growl. "Just a ghost, and you're about to have a very bad night." The thug's eyes widened in terror as John delivered a final blow, knocking him out cold. John stood up, dusting off his hands, and stepped over the unconscious bodies. He pushed open the door and slipped into the club. The interior was a chaotic mix of flashing lights, pounding music, and dancing bodies. The gang had chosen the perfect cover. No one would notice a few extra men hanging around, and the noise would drown out any suspicious sounds. But John was a master of slipping through unnoticed. He moved through the crowd like a shadow, heading toward the back of the club where the gang's stash was hidden. As he approached, he could hear the voices of more thugs, laughing and joking as they counted money and sorted through packages. "This is the life, man," one of them said. "Money, drugs, and all the girls you could want. Ain't nothing better." "You got that right," another replied. "And the best part? We got this place locked down. Nobody's getting past us." John smiled to himself. It was almost too easy. He waited until one of them moved away from the stash, heading toward the bar for a drink. Then he struck. He moved with lightning speed, taking out the nearest thug with a quick blow to the head. The man crumpled to the ground, unnoticed by his companions. John continued, taking out the second thug with a well-placed punch to the throat. By the time the last thug realized something was wrong, it was too late. John was on him, grabbing him by the collar and slamming him against the wall. "Where's the stash?" John demanded, his voice low and dangerous. The thug struggled, his eyes wide with fear. "Be back there, behind the wall. Please, don't hurt me." John nodded, satisfied, and knocked the thug out with a quick jab. He moved to the wall, finding the hidden panel that concealed the stash. Inside were stacks of cash, bags of drugs, and a few more weapons. He grabbed what he could carry, stuffing the cash into a duffel bag, and left the rest. The drugs he destroyed just like before. As he left the club, he could already hear the commotion inside as the gang realized they'd been hit. But by then, John was long gone, disappearing into the night. It might have not been as violent as his meeting with Hungry, but the damage wasn't that much smaller, especially if someone called on a phone booth to report screams and gunshots in a certain gentleman's bar, who said a vampire couldn't be a good citizen. The third gang was based in an abandoned factory on the outskirts of Brideshead. This one was going to be more challenging. The place was a fortress with high walls and a small army of heavily armed thugs. All they needed was a few watchtowers and they could go to war. But John wasn't about to back down. If anything, the challenge only made him more determined. He approached the factory cautiously, sticking to the darkness as he scouted the perimeter. There were thugs playing guard posted at every entrance, and he could see the outlines of more men patrolling the upper levels. They were prepared for a siege, but not for someone like him. John waited until one of the guards wandered too close to the edge of the fence before he made his move. He scaled the wall quickly, grabbing the guard and pulling him over the edge. The man hit the ground with a dull thud, unconscious before he could even react. The vampire slipped inside the factory, moving silently through the maze of machinery and rusting equipment between tables where the dope was cut and packaged. The place was massive, with multiple levels and plenty of places to hide. But he had a mission, and he wasn't about to get distracted. He could hear the gang members talking as he moved closer to the center of the factory, where the main stash was most likely to be hidden. "I'm telling you, man, the boss is freaking out. He's got everyone on high alert. Can you blame him? First Hungry's crew, then the nightclub. Who's next? Whoever it is, they're gonna get a bullet in the head if they try anything here." John smirked. These guys were so confident, so sure that they were untouchable. He was about to show them just how wrong they were. That, or there was some sort of virus making people stupidly brave in Gotham City. He crept closer, his eyes scanning the area for any weaknesses in their defenses. The main stash was heavily guarded, with at least a dozen men stationed around it. They were armed with shotguns, assault rifles, and a few handguns, enough firepower to take down a small army. Where are the cannons? He thought, looking everywhere but finding none. That's strange. Bitches love cannons. But John wasn't a small army. He was something much more dangerous, a tween's dream fantasy. He waited for the right moment, then struck. He moved quickly, using the darkness and the cluttered layout of the factory to his advantage. The first two thugs went down silently, their weapons clattering to the ground as they fell. The third managed to get off a shot, but it went wide, missing John by inches. "Who the hell is out there?" one of the thugs shouted, panic in his voice. "Spread out. Don't let him get away," one of them shouted, giving out the worst possible command. The gang members fanned out, searching for their invisible attacker. But John was already on the move, picking them off one by one. He used the factory's machinery as cover, slipping between the shadows and striking when they least expected it. The thugs tried to fight back, but how were they supposed to overcome a vampire of all things? Not that they knew. "Man, this guy's like a freaking ghost," one of them shouted, his voice trembling with fear. "Shut up and keep looking. We gotta find him." It was all in vain. John was everywhere and nowhere at once, always one step ahead of them. He took down another thug, then another until only a few were left standing. By then, the panic had set in, and they were firing wildly into the darkness, desperate to hit something, anything. John took advantage of their panic, closing in on the last few thugs. He disarmed one, elbowing him in the liver before knocking him out with a punch. Yeah, that man wasn't going to drink booze for a long time. The last two tried to run, but John was faster. He caught them before they could reach the exit, taking them down with a few well-placed strikes. When it was over, John stood in the middle of the factory, surrounded by unconscious bodies. He took a moment to catch his breath, then moved to the stash. Just like before, he took the cash and destroyed the drugs. It was time for him to come back home with the booty. The night would be over soon, and he wasn't eager to sleep in the sewers for the whole day. The next day, the streets would talk of a monster in Brideshead, hunting down drug dealers with a vengeance. Some said that it was the ghost of a man they killed during a shootout, back from the underworld to give them a taste of their own medicine. Others called it bullshit and said there was no way a single man could do all this. It had to be another gang trying to get one over their competition. In less than a day, there were a dozen different versions of the events, and even those who experienced John's own version of the Fist of Love disagreed about what truly happened. The vampire who caused this mess was oblivious, having gone to sleep thinking about how he could exploit the opportunity to make some actual progress in ridding the streets of the drugs that made the blood so disgusting. He might have broken the bones of the dealers, but the users were still out there looking to get high. Eventually someone would come to satisfy their needs for a few bucks, no matter how many gangbangers he beat up or how much money he stole, rightfully plundered. If he wanted to hurt the drug market, he had to get rid of the fiends keeping it alive. One thing was certain, though, things were about to change.
And that concludes this episode. If you enjoyed it, I'd seriously love it if you guys could leave a like on the video, as it genuinely helps out so much. and it keeps me going. Plus, it takes only 1 second. That said, have a wonderful day. See you in the next one.